They say power doesn't corrupt, it reveals. And tonight, surrounded by the hollow laughter of men who'd sooner see him dead than bow again, Duke Cadric Draven understood exactly what had been revealed in himself. The willingness to burn the world rather than release what he considered his. The ballroom glittered with false smiles and sharper knives, but he'd stopped counting enemies years ago. You don't survive the Northern Territories by fearing the pack. You survive by making them remember why they should fear you. Stay with me through the darkness ahead, because what begins in blood rarely ends in mercy. And the truth about monsters is that sometimes they're the only ones honest enough to admit what they are. The throne room of Blackthorn Keep smelled like old violence and older money. Caedric stood before the iron-framed windows, watching snow assault the glass, with the kind of persistence that killed travelers stupid enough to trust spring's false promises. Behind him, 3 members of the Royal Council sat in chairs that cost more than most northern families earned in a lifetime, waiting for him to acknowledge their presence like dogs trained to sit before feeding time. He made them wait, not because protocol demanded it. Protocol was a leash for men too weak to hold power without permission. He made them wait because watching them pretend patience while fury crawled up their spines like frostbite was the only honest communication they'd have all morning. Chancellor Aldrich finally broke. Your Grace, the king grows impatient with your autonomy. Cadric turned slowly. Aldrich was 60, fat in the way powerful men get when they've forgotten physical threat exists, with eyes that calculated profit margins while widows begged for food outside the capital's marble gates. Behind him sat Lord Harmond and Duchess Celeste, both watching Caedric the way you watch a wolf that's learned to open doors. Autonomy. Cadric let the word hang. Is that what we're calling sovereignty now? I wasn't aware the Northern Territories had become the king's property while I was busy keeping your merchants from freezing to death on my roads. The roads His Majesty's taxes built. The roads my soldiers guard. Cadric moved toward them with the economy of motion that came from too many battlefields. The bridges my engineers maintain. The mountain passes my men dig out every winter while your king counts coins in his warm palace. Tell me, Chancellor, how many royal soldiers died keeping the Dreadmore crossing open last February? Silence. None. Because there weren't any. Because when the storms hit, the crown's protection ends at the capital's walls, and my protection begins where your courage fails. Harmon shifted. No one questions your effectiveness, Your Grace. We question your methods. The execution of House Mordain without trial. House Mordain was selling northern children to southern pleasure houses. Cadric's voice dropped to something colder than the wind outside. I found the ledgers. I found the cages. I found things that would make you vomit your expensive breakfast, Harmond. So I executed every adult who knew, confiscated their holdings, and distributed their wealth to the families they destroyed. Which method troubles you? The part where I didn't let them buy clemency from your courts? The part where you acted as judge, jury, and executioner, Celeste said quietly. She was smarter than the other two, which made her more dangerous. The King's Law moves at the speed of bribes and bureaucracy. Justice delayed is justice denied, and in the North, denial means death. Children don't survive in cages while lawyers argue about jurisdiction. You speak of justice, Aldrich said, but you mean control. Everything you do consolidates power in Blackthorn Keep. The Merchant Guild's answer to you. The Northern Lords fear you more than they respect the crown. Even the Church avoids contradicting you. You've built an empire within the kingdom, Draven, and empires don't share power. They take it. Caedric smiled without warmth. Is that what you tell the king when you're poisoning his thoughts against me? That I'm planning a coup? I don't need to take his throne, Chancellor. I already have more real power than he does. The difference is, I earned mine by solving problems instead of inheriting them through fortunate birth and unfortunate genetics. Harmon stood. Your arrogance. Sit down. Is 2 words. Conversational volume. Harmon sat like his legs remembered orders his pride wanted to forget. Here's what's going to happen, Caedric said. You'll return to the capital and tell the king exactly what you came here to confirm. That Duke Draven has no intention of bending to pressure, threats, or whatever diplomatic fiction you're calling coercion this season. The North is mine because I bled for it. My people follow me because I keep them alive. And if His Majesty has concerns about my methods, he's welcome to spend a winter in the Dreadmore territories administering justice through proper channels while watching villages starve waiting for royal approval to defend themselves. The king won't tolerate this insubordination. The king will tolerate whatever keeps his southern provinces stable and his northern borders secure. I provide both. What I won't tolerate is interference in how I manage territories. None of you have the stomach to govern yourselves. Kedrick walked to the door and opened it. This meeting is finished. They left with the rigid dignity of men who'd been dismissed by someone they couldn't punish, which meant they'd already started planning how to damage him through channels he couldn't immediately throttle. Kedrick watched them go and felt nothing except the familiar weight of isolation that came from being strong enough to stand alone and smart enough to know it made him a target. His steward Matthias appeared before the council's footsteps, finished echoing down the corridor. 70 years old, scars on his face like a map of Blackthorn's bloody history. Loyal in the way only men who'd saved your life and watched you save theirs could be. They'll move against you now, Matthias said. They've been moving against me since I was 16, and my father died leaving me this frozen hell to civilize. The only difference between then and now is I'm better at killing. And worse at hiding it. Kedrick looked at him. Should I? Hide it? Pretend I'm something softer than I am, so men like Aldrich feel comfortable. Power that apologizes for existing doesn't exist. It's just weakness wearing expensive clothes. Power that alienates every potential ally ends up fighting alone. I've always fought alone. Allies are just enemies who haven't found the right price yet. Matthias sighed the way he'd been sighing at Kedrick for 20 years. Your father, My father was murdered by men he considered allies, poisoned at a feast celebrating friendship between houses. So forgive me if I don't share his faith in the goodwill of aristocratic snakes. Kedrick moved toward his study, Matthias following. What else? The Veilhart girl arrives this evening. Kedrick stopped. He'd forgotten. No, not forgotten. Deliberately not thought about. The arrangement made 6 months ago when Lord Veilhart's rebellion collapsed under the weight of its own incompetence and desperation. The old fool had gambled everything on overthrowing the king's taxation system and lost so completely that half his lands went to the crown and the other half to Blackthorn. As compensation for the soldiers, Kedrick contributed to crushing the uprising. The daughter was part of the settlement. Lady Seraphine Veilhart, 23 years old, educated in the capital's finest institutions, reportedly beautiful in that decorative way southern nobility bred their daughters to attract powerful husbands. A political consolation prize wrapped in silk and good breeding, delivered to Blackthorn Keep like furniture being repositioned after a foreclosure. I don't want her here. Unfortunately, your signature is on the contract. My signature is on a lot of contracts I don't remember signing. We have people for that. We have people who follow your orders. You ordered this arrangement after Lord Veilhart surrendered. You said a visible connection to a southern house would make the King's Council less nervous about your intentions. Kedrick had said that. He'd also been drunk and angry and still wearing blood from the final battle where Veilhart's pathetic rebellion died in mud and screaming. Tactical marriage had seemed smart then, a gesture toward integration, a symbol that Blackthorn wasn't preparing to secede from the kingdom despite having the military strength to try. Now it just felt like another obligation he didn't want. Where will she stay? The East Wing is prepared, far enough from your quarters to maintain propriety, close enough to the Great Hall to signal her status. Does she know what she's walking into? She knows her father sold her to the most feared man in the kingdom to save himself from complete financial ruin. Whether she understands what that actually means. Matthias shrugged. Most southern nobles think your reputation is exaggerated. It's not. I know. The study was Kedrick's favorite room in Blackthorn Keep because it contained no pretense. Stone walls, practical furniture, maps covering every surface, marking territories and threats and resources that required management. A fire burned in the hearth not for ambiance, but because winter in the north killed people who valued aesthetics over warmth. He poured whiskey older than most of the guards and drank it while watching snow continue its assault on everything that thought itself permanent. Tell me about her. Matthias consulted notes he probably didn't need. His memory was better than most people's education. Seraphine Veilhart. Third child, first daughter. Educated at the Royal Academy, where she studied philosophy, military history, and economics. Speaks 4 languages. Her tutors described her as unnervingly intelligent and dangerously outspoken. She was nearly expelled twice for challenging professors during lectures on governance theory. Shit. Perfect. An intellectual with opinions. Exactly what I need in a decorative wife. She's also survived her father's political disasters without being implicated or used as leverage against him, which suggests either exceptional luck or exceptional skill at managing perception. Kedrick considered that. Survival skills were the only skills that mattered. Everything else was decoration that looked impressive until reality tested it. What does she expect from this arrangement? According to the intermediary who finalized terms, she expects nothing. She made no demands, expressed no preferences, signed the contract without negotiation. The intermediary said she behaved like someone who understood she was a transaction, not a participant. That was either resignation or strategy. Kedrick had learned to distrust people who seemed too accepting of powerlessness. Real victims fought or broke. People who performed acceptance were usually planning something. When she arrives, bring her to dinner. Not tonight. Let her settle. Tomorrow. I want to know who I'm dealing with before the council uses her as another lever against me. Matthias left. Kedrick remained in his study drinking whiskey and watching Winter do what Winter did best. Remind everything alive that survival was temporary, and warmth was a privilege the world granted reluctantly. He thought about the girl arriving at Blackthorn Keep, with her education and her father's failure hanging around her neck like jewelry made from disappointment. Another person who'd learned to navigate around him because direct opposition got people killed and accommodation got them ignored. The Keep would swallow her the way it swallowed everyone soft enough to break. By midnight, she'd understand she'd been traded to a fortress instead of a man. By morning, she'd start planning how to survive it. He finished his drink and felt nothing except the cold certainty that trust was the first casualty of power and isolation was the price you paid for refusing to be destroyed. Bertaik. The gates of Blackthorn Keep opened at dusk under skies the color of old bruises. Seraphine Valhart stepped from the carriage into wind that hit like a physical insult, carrying snow and the smell of smoke from fires burning against the darkness. The fortress rose above her like something carved from the mountain's fury, black stone walls that swallowed light, iron gates thick enough to stop armies, towers crowned with flames that turned falling snow into sparks of dying brightness. This was not a home. This was a declaration that whoever lived here had conquered something fundamental about the world's hostility and decided to build from it. Behind her, servants unloaded trunks containing everything she owned that mattered, which wasn't much. Her father had sold the meaningful possessions to pay debts before selling her to erase them. What remained were clothes that no longer fit the life she'd left, and books that reminded her education was something you got to keep even after everything else was stolen. A man approached, old, scarred, moving with the careful economy of someone who'd been injured enough times to develop a relationship with pain. Lady Valehart, I'm Matthias, steward of Blackthorn Keep. Welcome. Welcome. As if she'd chosen to come here. As if this was a visit instead of an exile dressed as an engagement. Thank you. She kept her voice level, her expression neutral. First rule of hostile territory, reveal nothing until you understand the terrain. Your rooms are prepared in the East Wing. Dinner with His Grace is tomorrow evening. Tonight you should rest from your journey. Translation. The Duke didn't want to meet her yet. Translation. She was furniture being delivered to a room he hadn't decided how to arrange. Of course. I appreciate the consideration. Matthias studied her with eyes that had evaluated too many people to be fooled by performance. You're calmer than most arrivals. Most arrivals probably had expectations. And you don't? I have clarity, which is more useful. Expectations lead to disappointment. Clarity leads to strategy. Something that might have been approval crossed his face before discipline erased it. This way. Blackthorn Keep's interior matched its exterior promise. Stone corridors wide enough to march columns through, ceilings high enough to make voices sound small. Decoration limited to functional beauty like iron sconces and weapons mounted on walls, the way other keeps displayed art. Everything here served a purpose. Nothing was wasted on impression. They climbed stairs that spiraled up through the fortress's bones until reaching a corridor lined with doors leading to chambers that probably housed nobles who'd learned to navigate the dukes, territories without triggering his notorious temper. Her rooms were larger than expected. Bedroom, sitting room, a small library already stocked with books on northern history and governance that someone had selected with actual thought. A fire burned in the hearth. Windows overlooked the eastern mountains where snow caught moonlight and turned landscape into something beautiful and deadly. "Breakfast is served at dawn in the lower hall," Matthias said. "Lunch is informal. Kitchens are available. Dinner varies depending on the Duke's schedule. A maid will attend you in the morning." "What should I know about His Grace before meeting him?" Matthias paused at the door. "Duke Draven values 3 things: competence, honesty, and results. He has no patience for flattery, social games, or deliberate helplessness. People who waste his time discover he has efficient methods for ensuring it doesn't happen twice. And people who don't waste his time usually survive the experience." He left. Seraphine stood in her new rooms, listening to wind assault the fortress walls and feeling the weight of what her life had become settle over her like snow that eventually suffocated what it covered. Her father had destroyed himself chasing power he didn't understand through methods he couldn't execute. The rebellion had been doomed from its first meeting. She'd known it then, told him so. Been ignored because daughters who studied military history were decorative conversation pieces, not advisors. When it collapsed, he'd begged her to sign the marriage contract with Blackthorn as if she had a choice, as if refusal wouldn't destroy what remained of their house and leave her mother and younger brother completely unprotected. So she'd signed. Because strategic surrender wasn't weakness, it was survival. Now she was here, exiled to the North's most dangerous fortress, contracted to marry a man whose reputation traveled through noble circles like a curse that gained details with each retelling. Duke Cadric Draven, the Iron Duke, the Wolf of Blackthorn, the man who'd built an empire within the kingdom through methods the crown couldn't publicly acknowledge and couldn't privately stop. The rumors painted him as everything from brilliant strategist to barely controlled monster. They said he executed traitors personally, that he'd once ridden 3 days without sleep to prevent a village massacre, that he'd publicly humiliated lords who tried to intimidate him, that he trusted no one and demanded absolute loyalty from everyone. They also said he was impossible to manipulate because he saw through performance like glass and punished deception, the way storms punish ships stupid enough to challenge them, which meant every strategy that worked in the capital's sophisticated courts would fail here. Seraphine unpacked books and clothes while her mind worked through the immediate problem: how to survive in a fortress ruled by a man who allegedly destroyed anything weak enough to be destroyed. The obvious answer was don't be weak, but weakness was contextual. What the Duke considered strength might be what she considered unnecessary brutality. What she considered strategic patience might be what he called cowardice. She needed information, real information, not rumors filtered through aristocratic gossip. She needed to understand who Cadric Draven actually was beneath the reputation before she walked into dinner tomorrow and discovered whether she'd been delivered to a strategic marriage or an execution disguised as one. Sleep didn't come easily. The fortress made sounds like a living thing: wind in the towers, fire in distant hearths, boots on stone from guards patrolling corridors that never rested. Somewhere below her rooms, Blackthorn Keep continued whatever dark work gave it purpose beyond housing northern nobility. She lay in unfamiliar darkness and thought about her father's last words before the carriage left. Take care of your mother and brother? As if she hadn't been doing that already. As if his failures hadn't transferred their care to her years before his rebellion gave them official form. Tomorrow she'd meet the Duke and learn what survival looked like in the North. Tonight she'd rest and remember that power recognized power, and the only way to avoid being crushed by it was to prove you couldn't be. Morning arrived through windows that showed mountains refusing to acknowledge dawn. Everything still dark and hostile and patient, in that way nature was patient with humans who thought civilization was permanent. Seraphine dressed in practical elegance, wool dyed deep blue, silver threading that caught light without screaming for attention, hair bound simply because the wind here turned elaborate styling into immediate disaster. She looked like someone who understood that beauty in the North was measured by how well you survived it, not how much you decorated yourself against it. Breakfast in the lower hall was organized chaos. Soldiers, administrators, merchants, and nobles sharing long tables where conversation mixed battle planning with contract negotiation with gossip about families Seraphine didn't know, and alliances that meant nothing to her yet. No one acknowledged her arrival except brief glances that evaluated and dismissed her as another southern import unlikely to last through winter. She took bread, cheese, and hot tea that tasted like smoke and anger, and sat at the table's end listening to conversations that revealed more about Blackthorn Keep than any formal introduction would. Dreadmore Bridge needs reinforcement before next storm. Tell Herrick if he wants more soldiers, he needs to fund them. I'm not pulling men from the eastern border to protect his merchant caravans. The Duke rejected the petition, said if they wanted protection from raiders, they should stop leaving their villages undefended to chase better prices in the capital. Power flowed through practical concerns here, not abstract status. These people weren't worried about who sat where at formal dinners. They were worried about bridges collapsing and villages dying, and whether they'd have enough resources to survive what winter brought next. It was refreshing after years in the capital, where nobles spent more energy managing social perception than actual problems. "You're the Veilheart girl." Seraphine looked up. The speaker was a woman maybe 10 years older, wearing riding leathers stained with mud and something that might have been blood. Dark hair cut short enough to fit under a helmet, scars on her hands visible when she reached for bread, eyes that had stopped registering surprise somewhere around her third crisis. "Seraphine, and you are?" "Captain Lyra Thorne. I run security for the Eastern Territories." "Military security or political security?" Lyra smiled. It wasn't particularly warm. "Both. In the North, they're the same thing. Politics that don't account for military reality are just suicide with better wine. That would make the capital's entire governmental structure a delayed execution." "So, it does. We just don't tell them because watching them pretend otherwise is entertaining." Lyra studied her openly. "You survived your father's disaster without being buried with it. That takes skill or luck, and luck doesn't last long enough to matter. I separated myself from his decisions early, publicly. Made sure everyone understood I opposed his methods, even while I couldn't stop him. Smart. Also cold. Watching your father destroy himself while you stayed clean. He was destroying himself regardless. Staying clean meant I could protect my mother and brother after he finished. Sentiment doesn't rebuild families. Resources do." Lyra nodded slowly. "You might actually survive here. Is survival in question?" "Always. Blackthorn Keep eats people who can't adapt. The Duke doesn't tolerate weakness, and the fortress doesn't forgive mistakes. Southern nobles come here thinking their titles matter, and leave broken when they realize everything they knew about power was children's games compared to how things work in the North." What's different?" "Us. In the capital, power is performance. Here it's function. Down south, you gain influence by managing perception and controlling social narratives. Up here, you gain influence by solving problems that kill people if they're not solved. The Duke doesn't care about your family name or education or how prettily you can discuss philosophy. He cares whether you're useful or useless, and useless things get discarded." Seraphine absorbed that. "What makes someone useful to Duke Draven?" "Competence, results. Honest assessment even when it contradicts what he wants to hear. He's surrounded by people who die for him because he's earned it by actually protecting them instead of just demanding loyalty. But he's also ruthless about removing problems, and people become problems very quickly if they lie, manipulate, or put their interests above the North's survival. And if my interests align with the North's survival, then you'll do fine. If they don't..." Lyra shrugged. "There's a reason your father sent you here as payment. The Duke collects assets. Living ones follow his rules or become cautionary tales." It was the most honest assessment anyone had given her, threatening without being a threat, informative without revealing anything that could be used against its source. Seraphine recognized professional courtesy when she received it. "Thank you for the clarity. Don't thank me. Just don't waste my time or his. The North has too many real problems to accommodate drama from Southern nobility who can't adapt to how things actually work." Lyra stood. "Dinner tonight with His Grace. Don't perform for him. Don't try to charm him. Don't act helpless. Just be direct about who you are and what you want. He'll respect honesty even if he doesn't like what it reveals. Deception, he'll destroy you for. She left. Seraphine finished breakfast alone, processing information and building strategy. The pattern was clear. Blackthorn Keep operated on brutal meritocracy, where survival rewarded competence and punished everything else. The Duke wasn't a tyrant imposing arbitrary rules. He was an architect who'd built a system that functioned despite the kingdom's dysfunctional aristocracy. And people who couldn't operate within that system got removed like infections before they spread. Which meant her value here wasn't decorative. It was functional. She needed to demonstrate usefulness before the Duke decided she was just another southern noble taking up space. The library called. She spent the morning reading northern histories written in harsh prose that didn't romanticize violence or pretend survival was noble instead of necessary. The afternoon she explored the fortress, mapping its geography, and watching how people moved through it. Everything here served military purpose first and comfort second. Even the art, what little existed, was tactical. Maps, battle formations, architectural diagrams showing how to defend impossible terrain. By evening, she understood Blackthorn Keep's fundamental truth. This was a fortress that had learned to govern, not a palace pretending at war. Dinner with the Duke was held in a private chamber off the Great Hall. Smaller than she expected, functional rather than impressive, with a fireplace large enough to roast entire animals and windows showing darkness pressing against stone like it was testing for weakness. Caedric Draven stood with his back to the entrance when she arrived. Tall, broad-shouldered, in the way men got when physical power was a professional requirement rather than aesthetic choice. Dark hair long enough to be deliberately untamed. He wore black that probably cost more than most nobles spent on formal wear, but looked like work clothes on him, practical elegance designed for function. He turned when she entered, and Seraphine understood immediately why his reputation preceded him, like weather people tracked to avoid being caught outside when it arrived. His eyes were the coldest thing she'd ever seen, not cruel, not angry, just absolutely empty of the warmth that usually made human beings something other than predators who'd learned to walk upright and use language. Looking at him was like looking at winter personified. Beautiful in its terrible way, dangerous if you forgot what it could do, and completely indifferent to whether you survived the experience. Lady Veilheart. His voice matched his eyes. Control with nothing soft underneath. Sit, Etip. Not please sit. Not an invitation. An instruction delivered to someone whose compliance was expected because refusal wasn't being considered as an option. Seraphine sat, met his gaze without flinching because showing fear to predators was how prey died. Your Grace, you're calmer than expected? You're exactly as advertised. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. Recognition, maybe. Or surprise that she'd responded honestly instead of performing the nervous submission most people probably offered him. Servants brought food, venison, root vegetables, bread that smelled like actual grain instead of decorative flour, wine that tasted expensive without being pretentious about it. The Duke ate with the efficient focus of someone who treated meals as fuel rather than social performance. Silence stretched. Seraphine waited. Captain Thorne's advice echoed. Don't perform, be direct. So she ate her dinner and let the Duke decide when conversation was worth the effort. He surprised her by speaking first. Your father was an idiot. Yes. Caedric looked at her. No defense? No explanation about noble intentions and unfortunate execution? Why would I defend incompetence? He started a rebellion without sufficient resources, popular support, or clear strategic objectives. Then he expected loyalty from allies he'd cultivated through shared grievance instead of shared interest. Predictable failure from the first planning session. You knew it would fail. Obviously, anyone who studied military history knew it would fail. You crushed it in 6 weeks. That's not even enough time to properly organize supply lines, much less sustain armed resistance against Blackthorn's forces. And you told him this, repeatedly. He ignored me because daughters who study philosophy and military strategy are decorative conversation pieces, not advisors. He preferred listening to men who told him what he wanted to hear about righteous causes and inevitable victories. Caedric drank wine while watching her with those terrible empty eyes. Why didn't you join him? Because suicide isn't noble when it's predictable, and because my mother and brother needed someone capable of protecting them after he finished destroying himself. Bitum ushishin. So you stayed clean, publicly opposed his methods, made sure everyone knew you weren't complicit. Yes. That's cold calculation for a daughter watching her father burn. He was already burning. The question was whether I'd burn with him or position myself to salvage what remained. Seraphine met his gaze without apology. Sentiment doesn't rebuild houses. Strategy does. I chose strategy. Something that might have been respect crossed his face before control erased it. Your mother and brother were provided for in the settlement terms. Why? Because I negotiated for them before I signed the contract delivering me here. Made it a condition of compliance. They get estates in the southern provinces, annual income, protection from political retaliation. In exchange, you got me without resistance and a symbolic connection to a fallen southern house that makes you look merciful instead of opportunistic. Kedrick almost smiled. Almost. You negotiated your own sale. Someone had to. My father was too busy begging for mercy he didn't deserve. If I'd left the terms to royal intermediaries, they'd have structured everything to maximize crown advantage and minimize protection for my family. So I structured it myself to guarantee their survival. And what did you guarantee for yourself? Nothing. I'm the price, not the buyer. My value was in making sure the cost of acquiring me included protecting the people I actually care about. The Duke studied her in silence that felt like being evaluated by something that measured worth in survival metrics she didn't fully understand yet. Then he poured more wine, and his voice carried something almost like approval. You're not what I expected. I'm exactly what strategic necessity produced. My father's failure taught me that nobility without function is just expensive vulnerability. So I learned to be functional. Most southern nobles think function is beneath them. Most southern nobles inherit positions they didn't earn and lose them to people who actually understand how power works. I'd rather understand than inherit. Kedrick leaned back. What do you know about Blackthorn Keep? That it operates on brutal meritocracy, where survival rewards competence and punishes everything else. That you built an empire within the kingdom by solving problems the crown couldn't or wouldn't address. That you're feared because you're effective and respected because you're fair, and the combination terrifies nobles who mistake performance for power. She paused. And that you don't trust anyone because trust is how people die when they're important enough to be worth killing. He said nothing for a long time. Wind hit the windows. Fire crackled. Somewhere in the fortress, guards changed shifts with the efficiency of an organization that never rested. Why should I keep you here? The question was delivered casually, but Seraphine heard the test underneath. Demonstrate usefulness or be discarded. Because I'm functional in ways decorative wives aren't. I studied governance, economics, military strategy. I speak 4 languages, including the northern dialects your merchants use for cross-border trade. I survived my father's political disaster without being destroyed by it, which means I understand how to navigate hostile territory. And I'm here because you signed a contract that connects you to a southern house. But I don't care about southern houses. I care about survival, which means my interests align with yours because Blackthorn Keep is my survival now. That's a transaction, not a relationship. Transactions are honest. Relationships are just transactions people lie about. Kedrick laughed. It was brief and sharp and genuine, like she'd surprised him into something approaching actual emotion before his control reasserted itself. You're cynical for 23. I'm realistic. Cynicism is what optimists call reality when it disappoints them. He stood. Seraphine stood. They faced each other across a table that suddenly felt like negotiating space instead of dining furniture. You'll attend council meetings starting tomorrow. I want to know whether you're as competent as you claim or just better at performance than most. And if I'm competent, then you'll be useful. Useful things survive in Blackthorn Keep. And if I'm not? His eyes went cold again, absolute zero returning after brief thaw. Then you'll learn why people fear me. Worms. He left. Seraphine stood in the empty dining chamber feeling like she'd survived the first round of something that would eventually kill her or forge her into whatever shape this fortress demanded. She'd been tested, maybe passed, definitely noticed. Tomorrow she'd prove whether competence was performance or reality. Tonight she'd rest, knowing she'd walked into the wolf's den and walked out again without being devoured. But the teeth were still there, and winter had just begun. The council chamber was smaller than the capital's version and infinitely more threatening. Stone walls, practical chairs, maps covering every surface showing territories that required constant defense against nature and neighbors. Present, Captain Thorne, a logistics coordinator named Varys, the trade minister Eldon, and 3 military commanders whose names Seraphine didn't know yet, but whose presence suggested this was strategic planning, not ceremonial governance. Kedrick sat at the table's head. He didn't acknowledge Seraphine's arrival beyond a glance that placed her at the table's end where she could observe without participating. She observed. "Dreadmore Bridge is failing," Varys said, spreading reports. "We need full reconstruction before spring thaw, or we lose the entire eastern supply route. Cost? Of 40,000 in materials and labor. 3 months construction time if we pull crews from other projects." "Which projects get delayed?" "Southern border fortifications or the iron mine expansion," Kedrick considered. "The mine generates income that funds everything else. Delaying it costs us more than losing the fortifications temporarily. Pull crews from the border, reinforce the bridge, resume border work after spring. The Southern Lords will complain about reduced defenses." "Shit! What about our middays?" "The Southern Lords can fund their own defenses if they're concerned. Our priority is maintaining supply chains that keep northern territories functional." He looked at Eldon. "Trade situation? Revenue is up 8% from last quarter. The new merchant agreements with eastern provinces are working, but we're seeing increased interference from royal tax collectors who claim our independent trade negotiations violate crown authority." "Do they?" "Technically, yes. Practically, no. We're generating wealth that eventually benefits the kingdom. The collectors are just angry they can't skim their usual percentage. Tell them to submit formal complaints through proper channels, and we'll address them through proper channels, which means never. If they escalate, remind them that interrupting northern commerce creates instability, and instability in the north spreads faster than they can contain it." Eldon smiled. "Diplomatic phrasing for fuck around and find out. I don't do diplomatic phrasing. That's why we hire intermediaries." The military commanders reported next. Border skirmishes with mountain clans, bandit activity along trade routes, requests for additional troops from lords who wanted protection without funding it. Kedrick listened to everything and made decisions with the brutal efficiency of someone who knew delay was more expensive than action. Then Captain Thorne dropped a folder on the table. "We have a problem." "Specify." House Ardenmore is consolidating support among Southern Lords. They're positioning themselves as the moderate alternative to Blackthorn's northern dominance. Rumor is they're building toward a petition to the king questioning your authority and requesting royal oversight of the territories. Silence. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Ardenmore. Kedrick's voice was conversational, but something underneath it made Seraphine's survival instincts scream warnings about predators that sounded calm before they struck. The same Ardenmore that's been embezzling from merchant guilds and running protection rackets in the western provinces? The same. They're leveraging noble support by painting themselves as defenders of traditional aristocratic power against your authoritarian overreach. My authoritarian overreach being the part where I stop them from stealing and call it law enforcement. Correct. Varys leaned forward. If they get royal backing, they won't. The king is many things, but he's not stupid enough to destabilize the north to appease houses that can't govern their own territories without creating disasters. Ardenmore is projecting strength they don't have. Unless they force the king's hand by making this about royal authority versus ducal independence, Thorne said quietly. If they frame it correctly, the crown has to respond or look weak. And if the crown responds by limiting your power, we're all vulnerable to the kind of corruption and incompetence you've spent 20 years keeping out of the north. Kedrick said nothing. The commander shifted. This was the kind of political threat that couldn't be resolved with military force, which made it more dangerous because the Duke's usual solutions didn't apply. Seraphine spoke before considering the wisdom of it. House Ardenmore has a vulnerability. Every head turned. The Duke's eyes locked on her with focus that felt like being targeted by something that knew exactly how to kill what it aimed at. Explain. Their youngest son, Marcus Ardenmore. He's been operating merchant enterprises in the southern provinces using funds embezzled from the family holdings. His father doesn't know because Marcus routes everything through intermediaries, but the paper trail exists. If exposed, it proves House Ardenmore can't even govern their own family finances, much less critique how you govern northern territories. How do you know this? Braid Schwas Meshash. Well, because Marcus attended Royal Academy with me. He bragged about his schemes to anyone who'd listen, assuming Academy social circles were insulated from real consequence. I kept notes because information is the only asset that appreciates regardless of political changes. Bishas Matars Ishim. Silence. Then Cadric smiled, and it was the most dangerous expression Seraphine had ever seen on a human face. Get me everything you have on Marcus Ardenmore's schemes. Financial records, names of intermediaries, documentation of fund transfers. I want enough evidence that even the king can't ignore it. It'll take time to compile. You have 2 days. Captain Thorne will provide resources. Varys will help with financial analysis. I want this documented so thoroughly that when I present it to the royal court, House Ardenmore's credibility dies before their petition reaches the king's desk. And if they've already filed the petition, then they'll withdraw it when they realize opposing me means I'll expose every corrupt practice they've spent decades hiding. Political threats only work when you're clean enough to withstand counterattack. Ardenmore isn't. He looked at Seraphine with something approaching approval. Good work. I haven't compiled anything yet, but you will. And you'll do it correctly because you understand that information warfare is more permanent than physical warfare. Bodies can be replaced. Reputations can't. The meeting continued. Seraphine found herself pulled into discussions about trade routes and supply logistics, and how to restructure contracts to maximize northern advantage without triggering royal interference. Her academy education suddenly became relevant, theory transforming into practice, philosophy becoming strategy, abstract knowledge gaining functional purpose. By the time the council session ended 3 hours later, she'd contributed more useful intelligence than most southern nobles did in entire careers. Cadric dismissed everyone except her. They stood in the now empty chamber surrounded by maps and documents, and the physical evidence that governing was problem-solving conducted under constant threat of disaster. You've proven useful. That was the objective. So most people lie about their competence until tested. You were honest about it and then proved the honesty was justified. Lying would have been strategically stupid. You'd have discovered the deception eventually and punished it. Honesty cost me nothing and gained me credibility. Everything is transaction with you. Everything is transaction with everyone. It's transaction. I'm just honest about it. He moved closer, not threatening, but not safe either, like being near something powerful that hadn't decided whether you were worth not destroying. The Ardenmore information. That could have been your leverage. Held it back. Used it to negotiate better terms for yourself. To what end? My survival depends on Blackthorn Keep's stability. Ardenmore threatens that stability. Using information to protect myself while leaving the fortress vulnerable would be strategically incoherent. You're thinking long-term. Someone has to. Short-term survival is just extended dying. Long-term survival requires building infrastructure that lasts. Kedrick studied her with those empty winter eyes. You're dangerous. Functional people usually are. I didn't mean it as criticism. I didn't take it as one. He almost smiled again, then his expression shifted to something harder. House Ardenmore won't stop with one failed petition. They'll keep testing until they find vulnerability or I remove the threat permanently. When that happens, it will be violent and public and everyone associated with me will become targets, including you. I'm already a target. I was a target the moment I signed the contract connecting me to Blackthorn Keep. The only question is whether I'm a target with useful intelligence and strategic value or a target with nothing except liability. And you choose useful. Obviously, liability gets discarded. Useful gets protected. He turned toward the window where darkness pressed against glass. Do you understand what you've committed to? This fortress, this territory, the kind of enemies we make, and the methods we use to survive them? This isn't the capital where politics is theater. Here it's war conducted through multiple vectors simultaneously. People die. Families get destroyed. And mercy is a luxury we can't afford because mercy gets interpreted as weakness, and weakness invites attack. What? I understand perfectly, and I'm still here. Why? Because everywhere else I'd be decorative furniture in someone's political strategy. Here, I'm functional. Here, my competence matters more than my family name. Here, survival rewards intelligence instead of inherited status. She moved to stand beside him, both of them looking out at winter that never stopped threatening everything that thought itself permanent. You asked why you should keep me. I'll give you a better answer than I gave at dinner. Because I'm the only person in this fortress who understands you're not a monster. You're just someone who learned that the world kills gentle things and decided not to be gentle. And I don't need gentle, I need effective. Blackthorn Keep is effective. That's the first time anyone's described me without mentioning fear. Fear is what weak people feel. Respect is what functional people feel. I respect what you built here even if I don't understand all of it yet. Kadric was quiet for a long time, then, compile the Ardenmore intelligence. Destroy them so completely, the king uses their failure as a cautionary tale about challenging northern authority. Prove you're as dangerous as you claim. And then? Then we'll see if partnership is possible, or if I'm just collecting another asset that eventually becomes a liability. He left. Seraphine remained in the empty council chamber, feeling like she'd crossed some threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. The Duke hadn't accepted her yet. Trust clearly wasn't something he offered easily, or maybe at all, but he'd acknowledged her competence and given her real work instead of decorative responsibility. It was more than she'd expected, less than she needed, but enough to build on. She spent that night in her chambers compiling everything she knew about Marcus Ardenmore's schemes, cross-referencing with public financial records, building a case so thorough that even the best lawyers couldn't defend against it. By dawn, she had documentation that would destroy House Ardenmore's credibility and political influence permanently. By noon, she'd delivered it to Kadric. By evening, Blackthorn Keep's messengers were riding toward the capital, carrying evidence that would detonate like tactical weapons in the royal court. And Seraphine understood with cold clarity that she'd just participated in destroying an entire noble house. Not through combat. Through information, warfare conducted with the precision of someone who knew that reputations were more fragile than fortresses, and harder to rebuild once demolished. She felt no guilt. House Ardenmore had chosen to threaten Blackthorn Keep. They'd gambled their political survival on exposing vulnerability in the North's governance. They'd lost before they finished playing because they didn't understand that Kadric Draven didn't fight battles. He eliminated threats. And now she was part of that elimination strategy. The fortress celebrated quietly that night. Not because Ardenmore was destroyed, but because a threat had been neutralized before it damaged anything they'd built. Captain Thorne found Seraphine in the library and sat down without invitation. "You did good work." I documented incompetence. The work was already done by people too arrogant to hide it properly. Still, you saw the angle when no one else did. The Duke noticed. I needed him to notice. Useful things survive. Lyra smiled. You're learning fast. Most Southern nobles spend months pretending they're not terrified before they accept how things work here. You accepted it in one dinner and weaponized it by morning. Fear is inefficient. Acceptance is strategic. Just don't forget, the Duke rewards competence but punishes betrayal with methods that make battlefield deaths look merciful. As long as your interests align with Blackthorn Keep's interests, you're safe. The moment they diverge, she let the sentence trail into implication. They won't diverge. My survival requires his success. Transaction-based relationships are more stable than emotional ones because everyone understands the terms. Is that what you two have? A transaction? What else would it be? Lyra stood. Be careful, Lady Veilheart. Transactions are stable until they're not, and the Duke is very good at making sure instability gets removed before it spreads. She left. Seraphine sat alone in the library, surrounded by books about northern history and governance and survival strategies that required learning how to think like predators instead of prey. Outside her windows, winter continued its assault on everything that thought itself permanent. Inside Blackthorn Keep, power consolidated around a man who'd learned that the world killed gentle things. And Seraphine was learning the same lesson. 3 weeks after the Ardenmore intelligence reached the royal court, news returned to Blackthorn Keep. House Ardenmore had withdrawn their petition. Their lord had resigned from royal council positions, and Marcus Ardenmore was under investigation for embezzlement that would probably end in permanent exile or worse. The threat was neutralized. The Crown sent formal acknowledgement that Duke Draven's governance of northern territories remained unchallenged, and Seraphine's status in Blackthorn Keep shifted from contracted burden to recognized asset. Caedric found her in the East Tower where she'd been reviewing trade contracts looking for inefficiencies that could be optimized. He didn't knock. He never knocked. Privacy was another luxury power had taught him to consider optional. Walk with me. Not a request. She followed. They moved through the fortress in silence until reaching the battlements where wind hit like frozen violence, and the view showed mountains that never stopped testing the limits of human arrogance. Guards nodded to Caedric and ignored Seraphine, which meant she'd been integrated enough that her presence didn't trigger curiosity. House Ardenmore is finished, he said. Politically, financially, socially, they'll never recover influence. Their allies abandoned them before the investigation finished because association became liability. Good. You're not troubled by destroying an entire family? They destroyed themselves. I just documented it. She looked at him. Should I be troubled? Most people would at least pretend to be. Pretending is inefficient. They threatened what we built here. Eliminating the threat was logical. Guilt is what people feel when they confuse survival with sin. Caedric almost smiled. The kingdom fears me because I don't hesitate to do what's necessary. You don't hesitate either. I learned from my father's failure. Hesitation is how incompetent people die slowly. And competent people? Competent people die quickly or survive longer. The difference is recognizing which battles are worth fighting. He was quiet. Snow fell around them, melting on stone that had survived worse. Below the fortress continued its endless work. Soldiers training, merchants negotiating, administrators managing resources that kept northern territories functional despite winter's constant attempts at murder. I'm changing your title, Caedric said. You're no longer just Lady Valhart contracted as political arrangement. You're being named Duchess of the Eastern Territories with full governance authority and direct council representation. Seraphine turned to him. That's not symbolic. That's actual power. You've earned actual power. The question is whether you'll use it effectively or become another aristocrat who confuses authority with competence. I'll use it effectively. Prove it. The Eastern Territories have been mismanaged for years. Corrupt local officials, inefficient resource allocation, villages paying taxes for protections they're not receiving. Clean it up. Make it functional. Show me that trusting you with real authority was strategic instead of sentimental. You don't do sentimental. No, but I do make mistakes. Don't be one. He left. Seraphine stood on the battlements, feeling wind try to strip warmth from anything stupid enough to stand exposed, and thought about what she'd just been given. Real power. Not decorative responsibility or performative authority. Actual governance over territories that required someone competent enough to fix what broken systems had created. It was terrifying. It was exactly what she wanted. That night, she began planning how to dismantle corruption in the Eastern Territories and rebuild governance structures that actually served the people they claimed to protect. It would take months. It would make enemies of officials who profited from dysfunction. It would require methods that looked ruthless to people who preferred comfortable incompetence over uncomfortable effectiveness. But Seraphine had learned from the best. Mercy was a luxury, and competence was survival. She'd prove she deserved the power Caedric gave her. Or she'd learn why people feared the Iron Duke when they disappointed him. 3 months later, the Eastern Territories were transformed. Corrupt officials were tried, convicted, and removed. Resource allocation was restructured to fund villages instead of administrative overhead. Tax systems were revised to ensure protection was actually delivered instead of promised and forgotten. Bandits were hunted with the efficiency of military campaigns, because Seraphine treated security as infrastructure instead of optional expense. The changes were brutal and fast and effective. Complaints flooded Blackthorn Keep from nobles who resented Southern oversight and officials who'd lost their profitable corruption schemes. Kaedric ignored every complaint and sent additional resources to support Seraphine's work. The message was clear: competence was valued, incompetence was not negotiable. And anyone who thought the Duchess could be intimidated into abandoning her reforms would discover the Duke backed her with the same ruthless efficiency he backed his own governance. Seraphine returned to Blackthorn Keep after 4 months in the Eastern Territories, looking thinner, harder, older in ways that had nothing to do with time. Governing was war conducted through administrative channels, and she'd learned that battles against dysfunction were just as exhausting as battles against armies. Kaedric met her in the council chamber. They'd communicated through letters and messengers but hadn't been in the same physical space since he'd given her the Eastern Territories to prove herself. "The Eastern Territories are functional," he said. "Revenue is up, complaints are down, villages are protected. You did what I asked. Was there doubt?" "There's always doubt until results prove otherwise." He handed her a folder. "New assignment." Seraphine opened it. Diplomatic negotiations with Southern merchant guilds who wanted access to Northern resources without accepting Northern oversight. Sensitive political work that required understanding aristocratic manipulation while resisting it. "This is usually your work. I'm delegating. You've proven you can govern. Now prove you can negotiate without getting destroyed by people who specialize in manipulation. And if I can't, then you'll learn that competence in one area doesn't guarantee competence in others. But I don't think you'll fail. You're too strategic to walk into situations without preparation." She studied the folder. Complex negotiations requiring managing multiple competing interests while protecting Blackthorn Keep's advantages. Failure would damage the North's economic position. Success would demonstrate she was valuable beyond governance. "I'll handle it." "I know." There was something in his voice that made Seraphine look up. His expression was still controlled, still empty of obvious warmth, but something underneath suggested he wasn't just delegating work. He was testing whether partnership was real or strategic performance. "You're trusting me with this. I'm testing whether trust is justified. There's a difference. And if it's not justified," his eyes went cold again, "then I'll remove the vulnerability before it becomes a threat. That's how I've survived this long. That's how Blackthorn Keep survives." Suts. He left. Seraphine stood alone in the council chamber holding proof that she'd earned real power and real trust from a man who didn't give either easily. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like the ground shifting underneath her, because somewhere in the last 6 months, she'd stopped thinking of Blackthorn Keep as exile and started thinking of it as home. And that was dangerous, because home meant attachment, and attachment meant vulnerability. And vulnerability was how power destroyed people who forgot that survival required staying sharp instead of comfortable. But as she read through the diplomatic files and began planning negotiation strategies, she couldn't shake the realization that she didn't want to leave. Didn't want to return to the capital's decorative politics. Didn't want to pretend incompetence was acceptable or performance was power. She wanted to stay here where competence mattered and partnership was possible. And the man who ruled like winter personified had looked at her and seen something worth trusting. That night she lay awake listening to wind assault the fortress and thought about the careful question Lyra had asked months ago. "Is that what you two have? A transaction?" Then the answer had been obvious. Now Seraphine wasn't sure what they had. Partnership, maybe. Built on mutual benefit and strategic alignment, and the slow accumulation of trust between people who'd learned that trust was how you died if you gave it to the wrong person. But something else was building beneath it. Something neither of them had named yet because naming things made them real. And real things could be destroyed, and destruction was what happened when you cared about anything more than survival. She fell asleep still thinking about the Duke's empty winter eyes and wondering if emptiness was protection or prison. Morning brought new work. The diplomatic negotiations required traveling to the capital where Seraphine would face nobles who'd watched her father burn, and now saw her allied with the kingdom's most dangerous duke. They'd test her loyalty, her resolve, her willingness to choose Blackthorn Keep over Southern connections. She'd prove that Blackthorn Keep was the only connection she needed. But before she left, Kaedric found her in the courtyard where horses were being prepared. "One more thing." She waited. He pulled something from his coat. A ring. Not decorative jewelry, but the Draven signet, iron and black stone, heavy with authority that had been earned through generations of northern governance. Wear this during negotiations. It signals you speak with my full authority and have the power to make binding commitments on Blackthorn Keep's behalf. Seraphine looked at the ring. At him. At the impossible gift being offered by a man who trusted nothing and no one except through extended testing that most people failed. This is more than delegation. Yes. This is partnership. Yes. Why? His expression didn't change, but something in his voice softened just slightly. Because you've proven you're not temporary, not decoration, not someone who'll break. The first time governing requires methods that look brutal to people who've never had to protect anything more valuable than their social reputation. You're functional in every way that matters. And functional things that prove themselves repeatedly stop being tools and become... He paused, searching for words he clearly didn't use often. Become something more permanent. Seraphine took the ring, felt its weight, understood it represented trust that had been earned molecule by molecule through 6 months of proving she wouldn't waste it. I won't disappoint you. I know. If I thought you would, I wouldn't be giving you the ring. I'd be removing you before disappointment became threat. It should have sounded threatening. Instead, it sounded honest. And honesty was the only thing either of them trusted. She left for the capital wearing the Draven signet and carrying authority that made southern nobles recalculate every strategy they'd prepared for dealing with the fallen Valhart daughter who'd been sold to the North's most feared duke. The negotiations lasted 3 weeks. Seraphine destroyed every manipulation attempt with intelligence sharp enough to leave scars invisible to everyone except the people she humiliated. The merchant guilds agreed to terms favorable to Blackthorn Keep because refusing meant economic isolation from the North's resources and the Duke's protection. And when she returned to Blackthorn Keep with signed contracts that secured the North's economic independence for the next decade, Kaedric met her at the gates with an expression that suggested approval and something else underneath that neither of them would name yet. The guilds folded faster than expected. They had no leverage. You'd already secured alternative trade routes and supply chains. I just made them realize negotiating was better than being excluded. You threatened them. I informed them of reality. Reality is more threatening than anything I could invent. He smiled, genuine, brief, but real. You're dangerous. You keep saying that. Because it keeps being true. He took the signed contracts. These are good terms, better than I expected to get. I negotiated from strength because you gave me the authority to do so. Partnership produces better results than hierarchy when both parties are competent. Is that what we have? Partnership? The same question Lyra had asked 6 months ago. Now Seraphine had an answer. Yes, unless you're planning to revert to hierarchy. Sorry. No. Partnership is more efficient when it's built correctly. He looked at her with those winter eyes that were slowly learning how to contain something other than emptiness. Keep the ring. It's yours. Not delegated authority. Actual authority. The Northern Territories answer to both of us now. Both? Equally. Full governance partnership. You've earned it. Ishel. Something shifted in Seraphine's chest. Something that felt like ground stabilizing after months of testing whether it would hold weight. The Southern nobles will see this as you sharing power with a woman who destroyed her father's house to survive. They'll use it against you. Let them. Their opinion stopped mattering to me around the same time I realized survival required ignoring people who confuse perception with reality. And the king? The king needs the North stable more than he needs to micromanage how we govern it. As long as taxes flow and borders stay secure, he'll tolerate whatever internal arrangements we make. Kaedric paused. Besides, if he objects to shared governance, I'll remind him that everything Blackthorn Keep has accomplished was built by 2 people instead of 1. Results matter. Structure doesn't. Seraphine nodded, felt the weight of the ring on her finger, felt the weight of real power that came with real partnership. Felt something else she wouldn't name yet because naming things made them real, and real things were vulnerable. But winter was ending. Spring would come eventually. And maybe, just maybe, Survival didn't require staying empty forever. That night, alone in her chambers, Seraphine looked at the Draven signet on her hand and understood she'd stopped being the person who arrived at Blackthorn Keep 6 months ago expecting cruelty and getting partnership instead. She'd become someone who understood that power didn't have to mean isolation, that trust didn't have to mean vulnerability, that survival and connection weren't mutually exclusive if you found someone strong enough to understand that both required the same thing, honesty about what you were and what you wanted. Below her window, Blackthorn Keep continued its endless work. And Seraphine Draven, Duchess of the Eastern Territories, partner to the most feared duke in the kingdom, finally allowed herself to believe that exile had transformed into home. But shadows were gathering in the capital. Old houses resented northern power. New threats were building where old ones had fallen. And the partnership that had saved them both was about to face its first real test, one that would force them to choose between the power they'd built and the trust that made that power bearable. Because the kingdom was changing, and change always demanded blood before it delivered transformation. The warning came 3 weeks after Seraphine returned from the capital. Not through official channels, not through diplomatic correspondence, or royal messengers with sealed documents. It came through Captain Thorne standing in the council chamber at midnight, with blood on her boots and an expression that suggested she'd ridden hard enough to kill 2 horses getting here. Kedrick looked up from maps showing troop deployments along the eastern border. Seraphine sat across from him reviewing merchant contracts that suddenly felt irrelevant compared to whatever had put that look on Thorne's face. The captain didn't wait for questions. She dropped a leather satchel on the table and blood-stained papers spilled out like evidence from a crime scene that was still warm. House Kelridge is moving against us. They've been consolidating support among southern houses for months. This is correspondence between Kelridge and 7 other noble families. They're planning to petition the king for your immediate removal from governance and installation of a royal administrator in Blackthorn Keep. Kedrick picked up one of the letters. Read it with the same empty focus he brought to everything that threatened what he'd built. His voice when he spoke was conversational, but Seraphine had learned to hear the violence underneath. Kelridge, the textile magnates who've been losing market share since we restructured trade agreements to favor northern merchants. Correct. They're framing it as concern for royal authority, but the actual motivation is economic. Your reforms cost them millions. They want you removed and replaced with someone they can control through traditional corruption channels. How did you get these? One of their couriers got careless crossing through Dreadmoor territory. We intercepted the package. The courier didn't survive the interrogation. Seraphine watched Kedrick's face. No reaction, no shock or anger or fear. Just that terrible empty calculation that turned threats into problems and problems into bodies. When do they plan to present the petition? 2 weeks. They're timing it with the spring assembly when all the major houses gather in the capital. Maximum visibility. Maximum pressure on the king to respond. And if the king responds by installing a royal administrator, then everything we've built collapses. The administrator will be some incompetent aristocrat who'll undo every reform, reinstate corrupt officials, and turn the northern territories back into the dysfunctional mess they were before Blackthorn took control. Villages will starve. Bandits will return. The whole system will rot from the inside while southern nobles extract profit and call it governance. Seraphine spoke quietly. How many houses are backing Kelridge? 7 confirmed? Probably more waiting to see which direction the wind blows before committing. If Kelridge succeeds, they'll all claim they supported the petition from the beginning. If he fails, they'll deny involvement and pretend they were always loyal to the crown's northern policies. Political cowardice as strategy. Kedrick threw the letter down. Standard aristocratic behavior. Commit to nothing until someone else takes the risk, then claim credit for the winning side. So what do we do? Thorne asked. Seraphine answered before Kedrick could. We destroy House Kelridge so completely that every house watching decides supporting them was the worst strategic decision they could have made. Make an example brutal enough that fear overrides greed. Kedrick looked at her. That was fast, because the answer is obvious. Political threats require political destruction. Kelridge is betting the other houses will follow their lead if the petition gains momentum. Remove Kelridge and the momentum dies. The petition becomes irrelevant without a leader willing to risk everything pushing it forward. And how do you propose we remove them? Thorne said. They're one of the wealthiest houses in the kingdom. They have royal connections, merchant guild support, and enough gold to buy loyalty from half the aristocracy. Wealth doesn't matter if reputation is destroyed. and reputation is easier to destroy than people think. Seraphine pulled the scattered letters closer, studying them with the focus she'd learned from 6 months of governance work. These correspondences prove conspiracy against ducal authority. That's technically treason if framed correctly. We don't need to prove they're planning armed rebellion. We just need to prove they're organizing to undermine legally established governance structures. That's a narrow legal distinction, which is why it will work. The king doesn't want open conflict with Blackthorn Keep, but he also can't ignore evidence of organized conspiracy against his appointed administrators. If we present this correctly, he'll have to act against Kelridge to maintain the appearance of impartial justice. And once Kelridge is under investigation for treason, every house backing them will abandon ship before they're implicated. Kedrick stood, moved to the window where snow had started falling again because winter in the north never really ended. It just paused to gather strength. We'd need to move faster than they expect. Get to the king before the petition is presented. I'll ride to the capital tomorrow. Seraphine said it like she was discussing weather, not volunteering to walk into hostile territory where she'd face nobles who wanted Blackthorn destroyed and her removed as collateral damage. Present the evidence directly to the royal council. Frame it as loyal subjects protecting crown authority from internal conspiracy. You'll be walking into a nest of vipers who want you dead almost as much as they want me removed. Yes, and you're volunteering anyway, obviously. This is my responsibility as much as yours. Partnership means shared risk. Something crossed Kedrick's face. Not warmth exactly, but recognition. The slow accumulation of trust between people who'd proven repeatedly they wouldn't abandon each other when things got dangerous. You'll take 50 soldiers, elite guard, people I trust to keep you alive if negotiations turn violent. Negotiations won't turn violent. Violence is what happens when people run out of leverage. I have all the leverage. They're the ones conspiring. We're the ones protecting royal authority. Spoken like someone who's never seen how quickly politics becomes bloodshed when powerful people feel threatened. I've seen it. I watched my father's rebellion collapse into bodies and burning estates. The difference is, I learned from it instead of being buried by it. Thorne interrupted. If Lady Seraphine is riding to the capital, we need contingency plans. Kelridge won't take this lying down. They'll move against Blackthorn Keep directly if they think removing the Duchess eliminates the threat. Let them try. Kedrick's voice dropped to something colder than the wind outside. This fortress has survived worse than merchant lords playing at power politics. But you're right about contingencies. Double the guard. Lock down all access points. Anyone not essential to fortress operations gets moved to secure locations outside the main keep. If Kelridge sends assassins, I want them walking into a killing field, not a diplomatic residence. And if they don't send assassins, if they just accelerate the petition timeline to beat us to the king, then Seraphine destroys them in front of the royal court before they finish presenting. Either way, House Kelridge dies. The only question is whether it's political death or something more permanent. The meeting continued into early morning. Strategy, logistics, contingencies for scenarios that ranged from legal maneuvering to open warfare in the capital streets. By the time dawn broke gray and hostile through windows that showed winter refusing to acknowledge spring's theoretical arrival, they had plans that covered every angle except the one that actually mattered, which was whether Seraphine would survive walking into the capital wearing the Draven signet and carrying evidence that would destroy one of the kingdom's most powerful houses. Kedrick found her in her chambers after the meeting ended. She was packing light because traveling fast mattered more than comfort, and because everything valuable she owned was already at Blackthorn Keep anyway. He stood in the doorway, watching her work with that empty focus that meant he was calculating something he hadn't decided to share yet. You don't have to do this. Yes, I do. I could send intermediaries, diplomats who specialize in performance and negotiation that takes weeks we don't have. Seraphine didn't stop packing. Kelridge is moving in 2 weeks. We need the king's response before then. That requires someone with authority to make binding commitments and intelligence to navigate royal politics without getting destroyed by it. Intermediaries have authority, but not intelligence. I have both. You have the target on your back the size of the Northern Territories. I've had a target on my back since I signed the contract delivering me here. The only difference is now I'm armed. With what? Evidence that proves conspiracy but doesn't guarantee the king will act on it. Royal justice is selective. If supporting Kelridge is more politically convenient than protecting Blackthorn Keep, we lose regardless of how solid our case is. Then I'll make protecting us more convenient than supporting them. That's what political warfare is. Making your survival align with other people's interests so they protect you reflexively instead of strategically. Kedrick moved closer. Close enough she could see something in his eyes that wasn't empty for once. Something that looked almost like fear, except he'd probably forgotten how to be afraid of anything except the possibility of loss. I've spent 20 years building Blackthorn Keep into something that couldn't be destroyed by aristocratic politics or royal interference. Everything I did was designed to make this fortress untouchable. And now you're riding into the capital to protect what I built, and I can't follow you because leaving, Blackthorn Exposed, would be strategically incompetent, but sending you alone feels like losing. She said it quietly. Watched his expression shift through recognition and resistance and reluctant acceptance. Yes. Then don't think of it as losing. Think of it as partnership functioning correctly. You built something worth protecting. I'm protecting it. That's what partners do. Partners usually don't risk execution for treason accusations if the strategy fails. True partnership requires shared risk. You've been taking all the risk for 20 years. Let me carry some of it. He reached out, took her hand. His grip was careful, like he'd forgotten how to touch things without breaking them, but was relearning through necessity. If you die in the capital defending what I built, I won't die. I'm too functional to waste. If you die, House Kelridge won't survive long enough to celebrate. I'll burn every estate they own and execute every family member who knew about the conspiracy. The king himself won't stop me, because by the time I'm finished, royal authority will be the least of his concerns. It should have sounded like a threat. Instead, it sounded like a promise. The kind desperate people make when they realize something they considered an asset has transformed into something they'd destroy kingdoms to protect. Seraphine looked at their joined hands, at the Draven signet she wore that marked her as equal partner in governance of the North's most dangerous territories. At the man who'd built an empire through methods that terrified everyone except the people who understood survival required exactly that kind of ruthless clarity. I'll come back, with Kelridge destroyed and the petition dead. And when I do, we're going to have a conversation about what partnership actually means, because somewhere in the last 6 months this stopped being a transaction and became something neither of us planned for. What did it become? I don't know yet. But whatever it is, it's not something I'm willing to lose to merchant lords who think power is measured in gold instead of capacity for violence. Kedrick almost smiled. That's the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me. Your standards are concerning. My standards are realistic. Romance is what weak people use to avoid admitting they need each other. I don't need romance. I need someone who understands that trust is how you survive when isolation stops being protection and becomes prison. He kissed her then. Not gently because neither of them knew how to be gentle, but honestly because honesty was the only thing they'd ever offered each other. And when he pulled back, his eyes were still empty, but the emptiness looked less like winter and more like space waiting to be filled by something that hadn't arrived yet. Come back alive, obviously. I didn't survive my father's failure and 6 months proving myself here just to die protecting what we built. I'm too invested in the outcome. He left. Seraphine finished packing and tried to ignore the feeling in her chest that suggested investment had become something deeper and more dangerous than strategic partnership. By noon, she was riding toward the capital with 50 elite guards, and evidence that would either save Blackthorn Keep or destroy everything they'd built. The journey took 4 days through terrain that was hostile even in spring. Roads that turned to mud, bridges barely maintained by local lords who resented northern oversight, villages that watched Blackthorn soldiers pass with the careful neutrality of people who'd learned that. Powerful forces fighting over territory usually left the territory destroyed, regardless of who won. Seraphine used the time to refine her strategy. The evidence was solid, but evidence alone wouldn't be enough. She needed to control the narrative before Kelridge could present their version. Needed to frame this as loyal subjects protecting crown authority rather than northern territories defending their autonomy. The distinction was subtle but crucial because the king's response would depend entirely on whether he saw this as Blackthorn helping him or challenging him. Captain Thorne rode beside her most of the journey. The older woman had insisted on leading the security detail personally, which suggested she either respected Seraphine enough to risk her own life protecting her, or had orders from Kaedric to ensure the Duchess survived regardless of cost. Probably both. You're thinking too much, Thorne said on the third day when they'd stopped to water horses and assess road conditions ahead. Strategy requires thought. Strategy requires instinct. You've got the intelligence. Now trust your gut about how to use it. My gut says walking into the capital to accuse one of the kingdom's wealthiest houses of treason is how people end up dead in alleys with knives in their backs. Your gut is right, which is why we're not walking in quietly. We're making an entrance that forces the king to acknowledge us publicly before Kelridge can move against us privately. What kind of entrance? The kind that reminds everyone why Blackthorn Keep is the most dangerous force in the kingdom. 50 elite soldiers, the Duchess wearing the Draven signet, evidence of conspiracy delivered directly to the throne room during open court when every noble house is watching. Maximum visibility, maximum pressure. If they kill you after that, it's obvious assassination and the king has to respond or look weak. And if the king decides supporting Kelridge is more politically convenient than protecting Blackthorn, then we fight our way out and the civil war everyone's been predicting finally starts. Thorn checked her weapons with the casual efficiency of someone who'd killed enough people to have a relationship with violence. But it won't come to that. The king isn't stupid. He knows Blackthorn Keep is what keeps the Northern Territories functional. Removing the Duke would destabilize half the kingdom. He'll protect his own interests by protecting ours, unless protecting us costs him more politically than removing us. Then you make sure the political cost of removing you is higher than the cost of protecting you. That's what strategy is. Making your survival the path of least resistance. They reached the capital on the 4th day. The city rose from flatlands like a monument to wealth extracted from territories that produced actual value. White marble buildings. Gold leaf decorations on structures that served no purpose except displaying power. Streets wide enough for ceremonial processions, but not practical enough for actual commerce. Everything here was performance. Nothing was function. Seraphine hated it immediately. Not because it was beautiful, but because the beauty was hollow. Built on taxation that starved villages while funding aristocratic excess. Maintained through systems that rewarded performance over competence and inheritance over merit. This was everything Blackthorn Keep had rejected. Everything the North had learned to survive without. And now she had to navigate it without getting killed. The royal palace occupied the city's center like a tumor that had grown too large to remove without killing the host. Guards in ceremonial armor that looked impressive and functioned poorly. Courtiers in silk that cost more than most families earned in years. Nobles who'd never governed anything except their own social calendars discussing policy like they understood how kingdoms actually worked. Seraphine rode through the gates wearing travel-stained clothes and the Draven signet, and an expression that suggested she'd already calculated how many of these decorative aristocrats would die if. This turned violent. Word of her arrival spread faster than plague. By the time she reached the palace steps, crowds had gathered. Nobles, merchants, citizens who'd heard the Duke of Blackthorn's partner had come to the capital and wanted to see whether she'd survive the experience. The throne room was exactly as insufferable as she remembered from her academy years. High ceilings, stained glass. The king on a throne that probably cost enough to fund northern infrastructure for a decade. Royal Council members seated on either side looking like vultures waiting to determine which corpse was worth scavenging. And in the back, partially hidden behind other nobles, Lord Kelridge watching her with eyes that had already started calculating how to kill her before she finished speaking. Seraphine walked the length of the throne room with 50 soldiers behind her and silence spreading like frost. No one spoke. No one moved. The only sound was boots on marble and the whisper of 50 hands resting on 50 sword hilts. She stopped before the throne and did not kneel. Partnership with Blackthorn Keep meant equal authority to the Duke. Kneeling would undermine that authority. So she stood and met the king's gaze without apology. Your Majesty, I come bearing evidence of conspiracy against crown-appointed governance and treason conducted by houses sworn to uphold royal law. The king was 50, intelligent in that dangerous way powerful people got when they'd survived court politics long enough to understand everyone wanted them dead, but no one dared try it openly. He looked at Seraphine like she was a problem he hadn't decided how to solve yet. Duchess Veilhart, your reputation precedes you, though I confess surprise at your, dramatic entrance. Time is limited. The conspiracy I've uncovered moves within 2 weeks. Dramatic entrances ensure attention before evidence can be suppressed or destroyed. Bold accusations require bold evidence. What conspiracy? Seraphine gestured to Captain Thorn, who moved forward with the leather satchel. Documents spilled across the floor at the king's feet. Letters, financial records, correspondence that proved months of planning between House Kelridge and 7 other noble families. House Kelridge has organized a petition to remove Duke Draven from governance and install a royal administrator in his place, not through legal challenge or legitimate concern, but through coordinated conspiracy designed to undermine crown authority and replace competent governance with corruption they can control. Murmurs rippled through the throne room, nobles shifting, Kelridge's face going pale, then red, then carefully neutral, as he calculated whether denying or attacking was the better strategy. The king picked up one of the letters. Read it with focus that suggested he understood exactly what he was looking at and exactly what it meant. These documents prove correspondence between noble houses discussing concerns about northern governance policies. Correspondence is not conspiracy. Correspondence becomes conspiracy when it includes plans to bypass legal channels and force royal action through manufactured political pressure. Read the third letter, the one where Kelridge discusses timing the petition to maximize pressure on Your Majesty to respond before proper investigation can occur. That's not legitimate concern. That's political manipulation designed to force hasty decisions before evidence can be evaluated. The king read. The throne room waited. Somewhere in the back, Kelridge was probably planning how to kill her after this meeting ended, because letting her leave alive meant accepting defeat. Seraphine continued before the king could respond. Duke Draven's governance has produced quantifiable results. Revenue from northern territories has increased 40% since he restructured administration. Banditry is down 60%. Villages that were starving under previous leadership are now functional. The merchant guilds that signed trade agreements last month represent economic partnerships worth millions to the crown's treasury. These are not the results of tyrannical overreach. These are the results of competent governance that threatens houses who profit from dysfunction. And you believe House Kelridge organized this conspiracy out of economic interest rather than legitimate concern? I believe House Kelridge lost significant market share when Duke Draven restructured trade agreements to favor northern merchants over southern monopolies. I believe they've spent 6 months building political support to remove him so they can reinstall corrupt administrators who will prioritize their profits over territorial stability. And I believe if Your Majesty allows this conspiracy to succeed, you'll be replacing functional governance with the same dysfunction that required Blackthorn intervention in the first place. The king looked at her, at the documents, at the soldiers standing behind her who represented Blackthorn's military capacity to resist if this went badly. Lord Kelridge, you have response to these accusations? Kelridge stepped forward, composed now, face arranged in the careful neutrality of someone who'd spent a lifetime navigating court politics and knew that panic was how you lost. Your Majesty, I have concerns about the concentration of power in Blackthorn Keep, concerns shared by many loyal houses who believe that Duke Draven's autonomy threatens the delicate balance between crown authority and regional governance. These letters represent legitimate political discourse, not conspiracy. Political discourse conducted in secret and timed to prevent proper investigation. Because we knew Blackthorn would respond exactly as they have, with accusations of treason and military intimidation. Duchess Valhart stands before you with 50 armed soldiers. Is that legitimate concern, or is that threat? That's protection. Because houses that organize against Blackthorn tend to use assassination when legal challenges fail, an accusation without evidence. The courier you sent through Dreadmore territory 3 weeks ago carried instructions to bribe royal council members into supporting your petition before evidence could be reviewed. The courier was intercepted. The instructions were documented. Would you like me to present those documents as well, or shall we continue pretending your conspiracy is legitimate concern? Kelridge's composure cracked, just slightly, just enough to prove Seraphine had hit truth. The throne room erupted, nobles shouting, council members demanding order. The king raising one hand in silence, slamming down like dropped weight, because when kings demanded quiet, smart people remembered that royal power could still kill even when it looked decorative. Duchess Valhart. These are serious accusations. These are documented facts. Seraphine's voice cut through the noise. I'm not asking Your Majesty to take my word. I'm asking you to investigate before political pressure forces hasty decisions that destabilize functional governance. Blackthorn Keep has served crown interests for 20 years. We've earned the right to proper inquiry before being condemned by houses who profit from the dysfunction we eliminated. The king stood. Everyone else dropped silent because when kings stood during open court, It meant decisions were being made that would alter the political landscape. The evidence Duchess Valhart has presented will be investigated by impartial council review. Until investigation concludes, all petitions regarding Northern governance are suspended. House Kelridge and associated families will cooperate fully with inquiry or face formal charges of conspiracy against Crown-appointed administration. Your Majesty, Kelridge started. The investigation begins immediately. This court is adjourned. The king left. Nobles scattered like insects when light hits. Kelridge stood frozen while his careful conspiracy collapsed around him because Seraphine had beaten him to the king and controlled the narrative before he could present his version. She'd won, for now. But winning in the throne room didn't mean surviving the capital. Kelridge was too invested to accept defeat. He'd move against her tonight or tomorrow, or whenever he calculated assassination was worth the risk. Seraphine walked out of the palace with 50 soldiers and the knowledge that the next 48 hours would determine whether political victory became permanent or just delayed execution. Captain Thorne moved close as they descended the steps. That went better than expected. The king suspended the petition. He didn't dismiss it. The investigation could still conclude that Kelridge's concerns are valid and Blackthorn needs oversight. But it bought us time. Time for the king to review evidence. Time for the houses supporting Kelridge to reconsider whether backing a conspiracy under investigation is smart politics. Time works in our favor now. Time also gives Kelridge opportunity to remove the threat permanently, which is why we're not staying in the diplomatic quarter where assassination is convenient. We're securing the Northern Trade District where Blackthorn merchants control territory, and Kelridge's people can't move freely. And if they move anyway, then we prove that Northern governance comes with Northern consequences. Thorne's smile was not friendly. I didn't bring 50 soldiers for ceremony. I brought them to send bodies back to any house stupid enough to test whether we're serious about protecting what's ours. They reached the Northern Trade District after dark. The area was controlled by merchants who'd prospered under Blackthorn's reformed trade policies and had no interest in seeing the Duke removed. Buildings here were functional rather than decorative. Security was professional rather than ceremonial. Seraphine had sent word ahead, and 3 buildings had been cleared and fortified to serve as temporary headquarters. She spent the night reviewing the investigation timeline and calculating how long before the King's Council would complete their inquiry. 2 weeks minimum. A month more likely. Time enough for political winds to shift. Time enough for houses supporting Kelridge to quietly withdraw before being implicated. Time enough for the conspiracy to collapse under the weight of its own documented evidence. Unless Kelridge moved first. The attack came on the second night, not subtle, not surgical, not the kind of precision assassination that rich people hired when they wanted deniability. This was a statement. 20 armed men hitting the building from 3 directions simultaneously. Professional soldiers, not hired thugs. Kelridge's personal guard are close enough that the message was clear. The Lord wasn't accepting defeat. He was gambling everything on removing the threat before investigation could conclude. Seraphine was awake when the first window shattered. Dressed and armed because sleeping undefended in hostile territory was how functional people died stupid deaths. She moved toward the corridor where Thorne was already organizing defense with the efficiency of someone who'd fought in worse situations. How many? 20 that we can see. Probably more in reserve. They're trying to breach all 3 entry points simultaneously. Survivors? We're killing them all. No witnesses, no evidence except bodies that prove attacking Blackthorn representatives comes with permanent consequences. The fighting was brutal and fast. Trained soldiers crashing into trained soldiers in corridors, too narrow for formation fighting, steel on steel, screaming. Blood on floors that would take days to clean properly. Seraphine fought alongside the guards because standing behind them would signal weakness, and weakness invited more attacks. She killed 2 men herself. Quick, efficient strikes that ended lives before they could become threats. No hesitation because hesitation was how you died when violence arrived. The attack lasted 15 minutes. When it ended, 18 bodies lay cooling in the building and 2 wounded attackers were restrained for interrogation. That wouldn't be pleasant, but would be thorough. Thorne surveyed the damage with professional detachment. They sent their best. That was personal guard quality. Kelridge is done pretending this is political. Good. Makes the response simpler. Seraphine cleaned her blade on a dead man's shirt. Send the bodies back to Kelridge's estate with a message. Assassination proves conspiracy. The king's investigation just became a formality because attacking crown-appointed representatives is treason without requiring interpretation. And the wounded? Extract everything they know about who ordered the attack and who else is involved. Then execute them publicly in the trade district. Make sure every merchant and noble in the capital understands that moving against Blackthorn doesn't just fail. It gets you killed in ways that serve as warning to anyone else considering it. That's brutal even by northern standards. That's survival. Kelridge gambled that killing me would eliminate the threat before investigation concluded. He lost. Now everyone watching needs to understand that the cost of losing isn't just political embarrassment, it's extinction. Word of the attack reached the royal palace before dawn. The king's response arrived by midday. Formal charges of treason filed against House Kelridge for ordering assassination of crown-appointed officials. All holdings frozen pending investigation. Lord Kelridge himself placed under royal custody to await trial. The conspiracy was dead. The houses that had supported it publicly disavowed involvement and privately thanked whatever gods they believed in that they hadn't committed resources before the situation turned violent. Seraphine spent 3 more days in the capital, ensuring the investigation would conclude favorably, and the petition against Blackthorn governance would be permanently dismissed. Then she rode back to Blackthorn Keep with 50 soldiers and the Draven signet and proof that partnership meant shared risk, but also shared victory. Cadric met her at the gates. He didn't speak, just looked at her like he was confirming she was real and whole and alive before allowing himself to believe it. Kelridge is finished. Completely. Charges of treason. Holdings seized. Family reputation destroyed. The king used him as an example to every house that thinks organizing against crown-appointed governance is worth the risk. And the petition? Dismissed. The investigation concluded that Blackthorn's governance has been effective and appropriate. We're authorized to continue current policies without royal interference. She dismounted, stood before him in the courtyard while guards and servants and administrators watched their reunion like it was confirmation of something everyone had suspected but no one had named yet. I told you I'd come back. You did. His voice was rough, like he'd spent 4 days not sleeping properly. You also nearly died defending what we built. Nearly doesn't count. I killed 2 of Kelridge's men myself and supervised the execution of 2 more. Survival requires capacity for violence. I have the capacity. Something crossed his face. Pride, maybe, or recognition that the woman who'd arrived at Blackthorn Keep 6 months ago as political consolation prize had transformed into someone capable of defending the fortress with the same ruthless efficiency he'd spent 20 years perfecting. Come inside. We need to discuss what happens next. They moved through the fortress to his private chambers. Not the council room, not his study, his actual living quarters where no one entered without explicit permission. The space was as functional as everything else in Blackthorn Keep. Practical furniture, maps, weapons. Nothing decorative except the view from windows that showed mountains refusing to acknowledge human attempts at civilization. Cadric poured whiskey, handed her a glass. They drank in silence while tension that had built over 4 days of separation and uncertainty finally started releasing. You scared me. He said it quietly, like admitting weakness was still difficult even after proving partnership was real. When Thorne sent word about the attack, I nearly rode to the capital myself. Only thing that stopped me was knowing leaving Blackthorn exposed would be strategically incompetent. Partnership means trusting each other to handle threats independently. You trusted me. I justified the trust. Trust isn't supposed to feel like drowning. But watching you ride into hostile territory carrying evidence that could get you killed felt like losing. Yes. He looked at her with eyes that had stopped being empty and started being something else. Something that looked like vulnerability learning to coexist with strength. I built this fortress to be untouchable. Made myself into something that couldn't be destroyed by politics or violence or any threat the kingdom could produce. And then you walked in wearing your father's failure like jewelry. And proved yourself more functional than anyone I'd worked with in 20 years, and somewhere in. The process of watching you transform from transaction into partner. I realized I'd built something worth protecting, but I'd also found someone worth not losing. Seraphine set her glass down, moved closer, close enough to see that his hands were shaking slightly like adrenaline from fear he'd been controlling for days was finally finding release. What are you saying? I'm saying this stopped being partnership 6 months ago, and we both knew it, but neither of us wanted to name it because naming things makes them real, and real things can be destroyed. His voice was rough, but I can't keep pretending anymore. Not after watching you risk everything protecting what we built. Not after realizing that losing you would matter more than losing Blackthorn Keep itself. That's not strategic thinking. No, it's not. It's the opposite of strategic thinking. It's the thing I've spent 20 years avoiding because everyone I've ever trusted died or betrayed me, and isolation was safer than connection. But isolation doesn't work anymore. You made it stop working by being competent enough to trust and honest enough to believe and brutal enough to defend what matters, even when defending it means risking everything. She kissed him, not gently because neither of them knew gentle, but honestly because honesty was all they'd ever offered each other. And when she pulled back, his eyes were wet like he'd forgotten how to cry and was relearning through necessity. I'm not going anywhere. This is home now. You're home now. And whatever we're building here is worth more than survival. It's worth living for. He held her like she was the only thing preventing him from falling back into the emptiness that had defined him before she arrived. And Seraphine held him back because somewhere in 6 months of proving herself and defending what they'd built and learning that power didn't require isolation, she discovered that connection wasn't weakness. It was the strength that made everything else worth protecting. They didn't speak for a long time, just held each other while Blackthorn Keep continued its endless work around them and winter finally gave way too. Spring and something that looked almost like hope started building in the spaces where emptiness used to live. But hope was dangerous, because hope meant caring, and caring meant vulnerability. And vulnerability was how the world destroyed people who forgot that survival required staying sharp. 3 weeks after Seraphine returned from the capital, new intelligence arrived. Not about Kelridge. He was finished, executed for treason, his house dissolved, his wealth distributed to crown coffers in northern territories as compensation for attempted assassination of appointed officials. This was about something worse, a coalition. Not of southern houses trying to remove Blackthorn through legal challenges, but of northern lords who resented ducal authority and saw the duke's growing partnership with a southern-born duchess as weakness that could be exploited. They were planning armed rebellion, not against the crown, against Blackthorn Keep itself. And they were moving within the month. The intelligence came through channels Caedric had built over 20 years. Networks of informants scattered across the northern territories like tripwires designed to catch threats before they reached Blackthorn Keep. This time the tripwire had caught something that made every other threat look manageable by comparison. 7 northern lords, houses that had sworn loyalty to Blackthorn, families that had prospered under ducal protection and benefited from the reforms that kept their territories functional. They were planning armed rebellion, not political maneuvering or legal challenges. Actual warfare designed to remove Caedric from power and install a council of northern lords who'd govern collectively instead of submitting to single authority. The conspiracy had been building for months, quietly, carefully, using the same methods Caedric himself employed when destroying threats, which meant whoever organized it understood exactly how Blackthorn Keep operated and exactly where its vulnerabilities were. Seraphine stood in the council chamber studying maps that showed the rebel lords' territories forming a half-circle around Blackthorn's eastern and southern approaches. Strategic positioning. If they moved simultaneously, they could cut supply lines and isolate the fortress before reinforcements arrived. It was competent planning, professional, the kind of threat that couldn't be dismissed as incompetent aristocrats playing at war. Who organized this? Her voice was level, but Caedric heard the edge underneath. The recognition that this wasn't random rebellion. This was calculated insurgency planned by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Caedric stood at the window watching snow that had returned despite spring's theoretical arrival. His reflection in the glass looked tired in ways sleep wouldn't fix. We don't know yet. The intelligence only identified the participating houses and their timeline, not the architect, someone inside Blackthorn. Seraphine said it quietly, like speaking it louder would make it more real than it already was. No one outside this fortress knows our supply routes and defensive protocols well enough to plan around them. This is internal betrayal. The words hung between them like smoke from fires that hadn't been lit yet but would be soon. Internal betrayal was the nightmare scenario. External threats could be defended against. Internal threats were cancer that killed you from inside while you were still trying to identify the infection. Captain Thorne entered without knocking. She never knocked during crisis situations because time wasted on courtesy was time that could be spent solving problems. Her expression suggested the situation had degraded from bad to catastrophic. We have confirmation. Lord Heron of the Eastern Provinces is leading the coalition. He's been coordinating with the 6 other houses for at least 4 months. They plan to move in 2 weeks when Blackthorn forces are split between spring border patrols and trade route security. Heron. Kadrick's voice went flat. The same Heron whose territories I rebuilt after the winter famine 3 years ago. Whose daughter I personally rescued from bandits. Who swore loyalty on his family name and honor and every other abstract concept nobles use when they're lying to your face. The same. Thorne dropped more documents on the table. Financial records showing Heron's been stockpiling weapons and bribing border guards to look the other way while he consolidates forces. He's invested everything in this rebellion. If it fails, his house is finished, which means he's committed to success regardless of cost. Seraphine studied those records with focus that meant she was calculating something dangerous. What's his grievance? Heron prospered under Blackthorn governance. His territories are functional. His people are fed. Why risk everything destroying what benefits him? Because prosperity under someone else's authority isn't the same as power. Thorne's voice carried the weariness of someone who'd seen too many people choose destruction over subordination. Heron wants to govern his own territories without ducal oversight, wants to keep the reforms that made him wealthy, but remove the authority that enforces those reforms. He thinks he can have competent governance without submitting to the competence that created it. That's strategically incoherent. If he removes Blackthorn authority, the system that keeps his territories functional collapses. He'll be governing wealth that won't last beyond the first crisis. He doesn't see it that way. He sees himself as capable of replicating Blackthorn's success without Blackthorn's methods. It's the same delusion every successful subordinate develops when they forget they're successful because of the system they're operating within, not despite it. Kadrick moved to the table, placed both hands flat on the surface like he was physically holding himself in place before instinct told him to start killing people. How many soldiers does Heron command? 8,000 if he combines forces from all 7 houses, against our 4,000 garrisoned here and another 2,000 scattered across border posts. So he has numerical advantage and strategic positioning. If he moves when border patrols are split, he can hit Blackthorn Keep with overwhelming force before we can consolidate defense. Kedrick's voice was calm, but Seraphine could see his hands pressing harder against the table. White knuckles. The physical manifestation of rage being controlled through will that had been trained over decades. This is competent rebellion, not aristocratic theater. Actual strategic planning that could succeed if executed properly, which means we can't afford to wait. Seraphine straightened. We need to move first. Hit Heron before his coalition finalizes. Remove the leadership and the rebellion collapses without coordination. That requires knowing where Heron is and having forces positioned to strike before he realizes we've uncovered the conspiracy. Thorne pulled out another map. Our intelligence suggests he's consolidating forces at Ravenmoor Keep, his primary fortress in the eastern provinces. If we can reach him there, we kill him and every lord involved in planning this. Kedrick's voice dropped to something colder than winter. Not trials, not imprisonment. Immediate execution for treason and armed conspiracy against lawful governance. Make the cost of rebellion so permanent that every northern lord watching decides loyalty is safer than ambition. That's 7 noble houses we're exterminating. Seraphine spoke carefully. The political consequences are irrelevant compared to the alternative. If Heron succeeds, Blackthorn Keep falls. Everything we've built gets dismantled by lords who want authority without responsibility. The northern territories revert to the dysfunction that required ducal intervention in the first place. I won't let that happen because some nobleman decided prosperity wasn't enough if it came with oversight. The meeting continued through the night. Strategy. Logistics. Planning an assault on Ravenmoor Keep that would need to be fast enough to prevent Heron from dispersing his forces and brutal enough to send the intended message about rebellion's permanent consequences. By dawn, they had a plan. By noon, forces were mobilizing. 2,000 soldiers pulled from garrison duty and border patrols. The entire assault coordinated to hit Ravenmoor Keep in 72 hours, when intelligence suggested Heron would be meeting with his coalition partners to finalize rebellion timeline. Kadrick and Seraphine would lead the assault personally. Not because the tactical situation required ducal presence, but because removing internal threats required visible leadership. The soldiers needed to see their commanders willing to risk everything defending what they'd built together. They prepared in the armory where weapons were maintained with the care that came from knowing your life depended on equipment reliability. Seraphine checked sword edges and armor straps, while Keadric inventoried equipment with mechanical precision that suggested he was using physical tasks to avoid thinking about what the next 72 hours would require. She watched him work, saw tension in shoulders that usually carried authority without visible effort, saw the way his hands moved too precisely, like over-control was the only thing preventing loss of control entirely. "You're thinking about Heron. I'm thinking about how I misjudged him." Keadric didn't look up. "I rebuilt his territories, protected his people, gave him governance authority within Blackthorn's framework. I thought loyalty was earned through demonstrated competence and mutual benefit. I was wrong. Apparently loyalty requires something else, something I don't know how to give. Loyalty requires trust, and trust requires vulnerability. You're not good at vulnerable. No one who survives this long is good at vulnerable. Vulnerability is weakness, and weakness invites attack. Heron's rebellion proves that. The moment I gave him enough prosperity to feel secure, he started planning how to remove the authority that created his security. That's what happens when you trust people to recognize mutual benefit. They take the benefit and eliminate the mutual. That's not trust. That's transaction. Trust is when you give power to someone who could destroy you and believe they won't. Then I've never trusted anyone except you. And look where that got me. Planning to execute 7 noble houses because one of them taught me that trust is just delayed betrayal. Seraphine moved closer, close enough to make him stop working and look at her. You trusted Heron with governance authority, not with partnership. There's a difference. Partnership means shared risk and shared power, and the understanding that destroying each other destroys what you built together. Transaction means I give you something and you give me something, and the relationship ends when the benefit stops. Heron was always transaction. I'm partnership. Don't confuse the two. Keadric studied her face like he was looking for evidence that she meant it. That partnership was real instead of performance that would eventually break when pressure tested it. You killed men defending what we built. Nearly died in the capital protecting Blackthorn's authority. You've proven partnership repeatedly. But every time someone proves loyalty, there's this voice in my head that says, it's just elaborate deception waiting for the right moment to betray me. That's trauma, not instinct. Your father was murdered by men he trusted. You learned that trust was suicide. But I'm not your father's allies. I'm the person who destroyed House Kelridge to protect what we built. I've already chosen you over every other option available. There's no betrayal coming because there's no version of my survival that doesn't include yours. His expression shifted. Something that looked like belief trying to coexist with learned suspicion. I want to believe that. Then believe it. Because in 72 hours, we're riding into battle against men who betrayed everything you built for them. And you need to know that when the fighting starts, I'm standing beside you. Not because transaction requires it, because partnership does. He kissed her then, hard and desperate, like he was trying to convince himself she was real. And when he pulled back, his eyes were wet again because vulnerability kept showing up despite 20 years of training to eliminate it. If this goes wrong, it won't go wrong. We're better at violence than they are. That's why they're planning rebellion instead of open challenge. They know direct confrontation means death, so they're trying strategy. We're going to respond with overwhelming force that reminds them why direct confrontation wasn't an option in the first place. The assault force left Blackthorn Keep before dawn the next morning. 2,000 soldiers moving with the coordinated silence of people who'd trained together long enough to operate as single organism. No banners, no ceremonial armor, just functional war gear and weapons that had been tested in real combat instead of parade grounds. Keadric rode at the column's head with Seraphine beside him, and Captain Thorne commanding the rear guard. The journey to Ravenmoor Keep would take 60 hours through terrain that was hostile even in good weather. They were racing timeline. If Heron discovered the assault before it arrived, he'd scatter his forces and the rebellion would transform from centralized threat into guerrilla warfare that could last years. Speed mattered more than stealth. They moved fast enough to reach Ravenmoor before intelligence could warn the rebels, but not so fast that horses collapsed from exhaustion before the battle started. The first night they camped in abandoned villages that had been evacuated when borders shifted during territorial conflicts a decade ago. Empty buildings that still carried echoes of families who'd lived here before politics and violence made survival impossible. Seraphine walked through houses where children's toys still lay scattered like the evacuation had been too sudden for proper packing. Keadric found her in what used to be someone's kitchen. Stone hearth, cold for years. Table still set with wooden plates that hadn't been valuable enough to carry during flight. You're thinking about what happens if we fail. I'm thinking about what happens if we succeed. We're about to execute 7 noble houses. That's not war. That's extermination. Every family, every servant, every person who knew about the rebellion or benefited from Heron's planning. We're erasing them completely, because that's what internal betrayal requires. External threats get defeated and the survivors learn lessons. Internal threats get removed permanently because mercy toward betrayal invites more betrayal. It's brutal, but it's necessary. Seraphine looked at him. At the man who'd built an empire through methods the kingdom couldn't acknowledge and couldn't stop. At the person she'd chosen to partner with despite understanding exactly what that partnership required. I know it's necessary. That doesn't make it easy. These used to be your allies. People who swore loyalty. Now we're riding to kill them and everyone they know. At what point does protecting what we built turn into becoming the threat we were protecting against? We're not the threat. Heron is the threat. He chose rebellion. He organized conspiracy. He decided prosperity under oversight wasn't enough because he wanted power without accountability. We didn't create this situation. We're responding to it with the only methods that work when people decide betrayal is worth the risk. And if responding with extermination makes everyone else more afraid of us than loyal to us, then they'll be afraid. Fear is more reliable than loyalty anyway. Loyalty requires trust, and trust is how we ended up here. Fear just requires demonstrating that opposition has permanent consequences. That's not governance. That's tyranny. Kedrick's expression went cold. Call it whatever you want. In 72 hours, either Blackthorn Keep survives and the Northern Territories stay functional, or Heron succeeds and everything collapses into the same dysfunction that required ducal intervention in the first place. I know which outcome I'm fighting for. If that makes me a tyrant, I'll accept the title as long as the territories stay protected. He left. Seraphine stood alone in the abandoned kitchen, feeling the weight of what they were about to do settle over her like snow that eventually suffocated what it covered. She'd killed before, defended Blackthorn, destroyed Kelridge. But this was different. This was premeditated extermination of people who used to be allies. This was crossing a line that separated governance from something darker. But Heron had crossed the line first, had chosen betrayal, had organized rebellion that would destroy everything if it succeeded. And survival required responding to betrayal with methods brutal enough to prevent repetition. She told herself that. Repeated it like prayer, except she didn't believe in prayer because faith required trust, and trust had become the luxury they couldn't afford. They reached Ravenmoor Keep at dawn on the 3rd day. The fortress sat in a valley surrounded by hills that should have provided defensive advantage, but instead created a kill box when the assault force spread across the high ground with archers positioned to rain death on anything that moved in the courtyard below. Intelligence had been accurate. Heron's coalition was gathered inside. 7 lords and their military commanders finalizing rebellion plans without knowing the rebellion had already failed because Blackthorn had uncovered it before execution began. Kedrick positioned forces with the precision of someone who'd spent 20 years turning tactical theory into practical slaughter. Archers on the high ground, infantry blocking all exit routes, cavalry positioned to pursue anyone who broke through the initial assault. No one inside Ravenmoor Keep would survive the next hour unless they were valuable enough to interrogate about who else knew and didn't report the conspiracy. Seraphine stood beside him, watching soldiers move into position. She'd insisted on being here despite Kedrick's suggestion that she coordinate from Blackthorn Keep. Partnership meant shared risk. If he was ordering extermination, she was present for it. No delegation, no distance. If they were becoming monsters to protect what they'd built, they'd become monsters together. Captain Thorne appeared with the assault force ready. All positions confirmed. Ravenmoor is surrounded. Nothing leaves alive unless we allow it. Kedrick nodded. Looked at Seraphine one final time, like he was giving her opportunity to object, to say this was too far. That extermination wasn't governance, and survival didn't justify becoming the thing they'd spent months fighting against. She met his gaze without flinching. Do it. The assault began with arrows, hundreds of them arcing over walls into the courtyard, where soldiers and servants and lords who'd planned rebellion suddenly discovered that planning wasn't the same as executing, and betrayal came with consequences more permanent than political disadvantage. Screaming, chaos, people running for cover that didn't exist because the archers had been positioned to eliminate cover before the assault started. Bodies falling, blood on stone that had been gray and was rapidly turning red. The infantry moved in after the first volley. Breaching gates, flooding through corridors, killing everyone they encountered because the order had been explicit. No survivors except those valuable for intelligence. Servants died beside soldiers, cooks beside commanders. The fortress that had been Heron's seat of power transformed into abattoir, where the only distinction was how quickly death arrived. Seraphine watched from the high ground, with Kaedric beside her, and tried to feel something other than cold calculation about efficiency. Tried to access the part of herself that should have been horrified by coordinated slaughter of hundreds of people whose crime was serving lords who'd chosen betrayal. She felt nothing except grim satisfaction that the threat was being eliminated before it could damage what she and Kaedric had built. That absence of feeling scared her more than the violence. The fighting lasted 90 minutes. When it ended, Ravenmore Keep was silent, except for wounded men begging for death that wouldn't come until interrogation extracted every useful piece of information about the conspiracy's scope and network. Heron was brought before Kaedric in chains. The lord who'd sworn loyalty and taken prosperity and decided it wasn't enough. His face was bloody, his armor torn, his expression cycling between defiance and terror. Because he understood exactly what was about to happen and exactly how much it would hurt before death arrived. Kaedric looked at him with eyes that had gone completely empty again. All the vulnerability, all the almost warmth that Seraphine had been slowly uncovering through months of partnership, gone. Replaced by the man who'd learned that trust was weakness and mercy was the first crack in an empire's foundation. Give me one reason I shouldn't execute you right now. Heron spat blood. You're a tyrant. Everything they said about you was true. You don't govern. You dominate. You don't lead. You control. The Northern Territories would be better off without you. The Northern Territories were starving and lawless before I took control. I rebuilt what incompetent lords like you destroyed through corruption and negligence. I created the prosperity you enjoyed, and you repaid that by organizing rebellion that would have killed thousands if it succeeded. Kaedric's voice was flat. So I'll ask again, give me one reason I shouldn't execute you. Because executing me proves I was right. That you're not a leader. You're a monster who rules through fear because you're too damaged to understand loyalty. The words hit harder than they should have. Seraphine saw Kaedric flinch, barely visible. Just the smallest crack in control before discipline reasserted itself. But the damage was done, because Heron had identified the fear that lived underneath everything Kaedric had built. The suspicion that governance through competence was just dressed-up tyranny. That protection was control. That loyalty was coercion. That everything he'd accomplished was just elaborate violence disguised as civilization. Kaedric drew his sword. The blade was clean because he'd led the assault, but hadn't participated in the actual killing. He'd watched instead, supervising, ensuring the extermination was thorough. Now he'd finish it personally, because leaders who ordered death needed to be willing to deliver it themselves. You're right about one thing. I am a monster. But I'm the monster that keeps the Northern Territories functional when men like you would rather burn them down than submit to authority you didn't grant yourself. So yes, I rule through fear. Because fear is honest, loyalty is performance, and I'm done pretending performance is real. He executed Heron with single stroke, clean, efficient. The lord who'd organized rebellion died before his body understood it should fall. The corpse hit stone with sound that echoed across the valley, where 2,000 soldiers watched there. Commander, eliminate internal threat with the same brutal efficiency he brought to every other problem. 6 more lords were executed in the next hour. Brought before Kaedric one at a time, and killed with the mechanical precision of someone who'd learned to separate emotion from necessity. Each death was quick because torture wasn't the point. Permanent removal was the point. Sending message that betrayal ended in extinction, not pain. Seraphine watched all 7 executions without looking away. Partnership meant witnessing what power required, even when witnessing felt like losing pieces of yourself you'd need later. When it finished, Ravenmore Keep was occupied by Blackthorn forces. The fortress that had been center of rebellion became garrison housing soldiers who'd ensure Eastern Territories. Understood that authority came from Blackthorn Keep, and opposition came with consequences too permanent to survive. They burned the bodies in a pyre visible for miles, smoke rising into sky like signal fire, announcing that internal betrayal had been discovered and eliminated before it damaged what needed protecting. Kaedric watched the fire with expression that suggested he was burning more than bodies. He was burning whatever remaining belief he'd maintained that partnership could exist without vulnerability, and vulnerability could exist without eventual betrayal. Seraphine stood beside him, knowing that something fundamental had broken during the executions. Not in the fortress, not in Blackthorn's authority, in Kaedric himself. The man who'd slowly started learning that trust was possible had just received definitive proof that trust was suicide. Heron's betrayal had confirmed every paranoid instinct that 20 years of survival had trained into permanent doctrine. "We need to talk." He didn't look at her. "There's nothing to talk about. The threat is eliminated. Blackthorn Keep is secure. The territories are stable. We accomplished the objective. The objective was stopping rebellion, not destroying whatever remained of your ability to believe loyalty exists. Loyalty doesn't exist." Heron proved that. "I gave him everything. Rebuilt his territories, protected his people, shared governance authority. And he repaid it by organizing rebellion that would have killed me if we hadn't discovered it first. That's not partnership. That's transaction waiting for better offer." Heron was transaction from the beginning. I've told you that. Partnership is different. Partnership is another word for delayed betrayal. You haven't betrayed me yet because you haven't found the right price. But you will. Everyone does eventually. It's just a matter of time and opportunity. The words landed like physical blows. Seraphine felt something crack inside her chest because she'd spent 8 months proving loyalty and partnership and shared risk, and apparently none of it mattered because one lord's betrayal had erased everything she'd built with Kaedric. You don't believe that. I do. I have to. Because believing otherwise is how I end up dead like my father. Trusting people who seemed loyal until they weren't. His voice was hollow. I let myself forget that for a while. With you. Started believing partnership was real instead of strategic performance. Heron reminded me why that's dangerous. So thank you for the lesson. It was expensive but necessary. What lesson? That isolation is survival. That trust is weakness. That power shared is power lost. He finally looked at her and his eyes were completely empty again. All the warmth gone. All the vulnerability buried. Just Winter staring at her like she was another threat that needed calculating. I made a mistake giving you equal authority. Made another mistake believing partnership was anything except tactical arrangement. I'm correcting both mistakes now. Seraphine felt cold spreading through her body. What are you saying? I'm saying your governance authority in the Eastern Territories is revoked. You'll return to Blackthorn Keep as contracted arrangement, not partner, not equal authority, just the political alliance your father's surrender purchased. You'll have rooms and resources and protection, but no power. Because power requires trust, and trust requires belief that betrayal isn't inevitable. I don't have that belief anymore. After everything I've done, everything I've proven, you're reducing me to decorative furniture because Heron betrayed you and you're too damaged to distinguish between transaction and partnership. I'm protecting what I built before you arrived and will exist after you're gone. That's governance. Everything else is sentiment that gets people killed. He walked away, left her standing beside the pyre-burning bodies of men who'd chosen betrayal and paid for it with extinction. Left her with the understanding that Heron's conspiracy hadn't just threatened Blackthorn Keep. It had destroyed whatever progress Kaedric had made toward believing connection was possible. Captain Thorne found her an hour later. Seraphine was still standing in the same spot watching smoke rise into sky and trying to figure out how 8 months of partnership had collapsed into nothing because one traitor had confirmed every paranoid instinct Kaedric carried like scar tissue. He's wrong, you know. Thorne's voice was careful. About you. About partnership. He's reacting from trauma instead of thinking strategically. He's reacting exactly how his survival instincts demand. Trust got his father killed. Trust nearly got him killed. He's learned that isolation is safer than connection. I can't fight 20 years of learned behavior. You already have. You spent 8 months proving loyalty. Nearly died protecting Blackthorn. Killed to defend what you built together. That's not performance. That's real. Real doesn't matter if he can't believe it's real. Seraphine's voice was hollow. Heron broke something fundamental in him. Something that was already broken and barely healing. Now it's shattered completely and I don't know how to fix it because he won't let me close enough to try. So what will you do? The question hung in air that smelled like burning bodies and failure. Seraphine had 3 options. Accept the demotion and survive as decorative arrangement. Leave Blackthorn Keep and abandon everything she'd built. Or fight for partnership that Kaedric had decided didn't exist. The first option was surrender. The second was retreat. The third was war against someone she loved who'd stopped believing love was anything except weaponized vulnerability. She didn't have an answer yet. Just cold certainty that whatever she chose would define everything that came after, would determine whether Blackthorn Keep survived as shared power or collapsed into the same tyrannical isolation Kaedric had built originally, would determine whether the man she'd chosen to partner with could learn that trust wasn't suicide, or whether trauma would trap him permanently in the emptiness he'd spent 2 decades perfecting. The smoke kept rising, the bodies kept burning, and Seraphine stood in the ruins of partnership, trying to decide whether fighting for someone who'd stopped fighting for connection was salvation, or just elaborate suicide dressed as loyalty. She'd spent her entire life learning that survival required strategic calculation instead of sentiment. That emotion was weakness, and attachment was liability, and love was just another transaction waiting to fail when pressure tested it. But standing beside the pyre watching Kaedric's walls rebuild themselves brick by brutal brick, she realized that strategic calculation had limits, that some things couldn't be solved through intelligence or planning or forcing outcomes through sheer competence. Some things required the exact vulnerability Kaedric had learned to eliminate. Required believing connection was worth the risk, even when every piece of evidence suggested it wasn't. Required fighting for partnership not because strategy demanded it, but because the alternative was 2 people who'd proven they could survive anything except each other, choosing isolation over the chance that maybe, possibly, trust wasn't always betrayal. 3 days later, they returned to Blackthorn Keep, the fortress that had been home. Seraphine's rooms in the East Wing had been maintained, but everything that signaled partnership had been removed. No access to council chambers, no governance authority, no presence in decisions that shaped northern territories. She'd been reduced from partner to prisoner, except the prison had comfortable furniture and the chains were made from contracts instead of iron. Kaedric avoided her. When they passed in corridors, he looked through her like she was architecture instead of person. At meals, he sat at opposite ends of tables and left before conversation could develop. He'd performed amputation on partnership with the same surgical precision he brought to eliminating threats. Except she wasn't eliminated, just isolated. Kept close enough to fulfill contractual obligations, but far enough to prevent the vulnerability that came with actual connection. It should have made her angry. Should have triggered the same cold calculation that had helped her survive her father's failure and navigate capital politics and destroy Kelridge. Should have activated every survival instinct that said accept reality and adapt or leave before stagnation became death. Instead, she felt something that looked almost like grief, for the partnership that had existed, for the man who'd slowly started believing connection was possible, for the future they'd been building before Heron's betrayal shattered the foundation underneath it. 2 weeks after Ravenmoor, intelligence arrived about new threats gathering in southern provinces. Houses that had watched Blackthorn eliminate Kelridge and Heron and decided the Duke's growing isolation made him vulnerable to coordinated pressure. They were planning another petition, another attempt to force royal intervention in northern governance. The council meeting to address it happened without Seraphine. She learned about it from servants who whispered about how cold the Duke had been, how he'd dismissed strategies that required trust or partnership, or anything except unilateral authority enforced through fear, how he'd become exactly what Heron accused him of being, a monster who ruled through domination because he'd forgotten how to do anything else. That night, Seraphine made her decision, not the strategic calculation she'd relied on her entire life, not the careful assessment of costs and benefits and optimal outcomes, just the recognition that some battles were worth fighting even when victory wasn't guaranteed, that partnership mattered more than self-preservation, that love wasn't transaction and trust wasn't weakness and connection was exactly the strength that made survival worth the effort. She walked to Kaedric's chambers after midnight, didn't knock, didn't wait for permission, just walked in like she'd done dozens of times before when partnership was real instead of memory. He was at his desk reviewing intelligence reports and planning responses to threats that multiplied because isolation bred vulnerability. He looked up when she entered, and his expression cycled through surprise and control and something that might have been hope before discipline erased it. You're not supposed to be here. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Defending partnership that you decided doesn't exist because you're too afraid to believe it's real. I'm not afraid. I'm realistic. Trust is how people die. Heron proved that. Heron proved that transactions fail, not that partnership fails. There's a difference, and you know it. Seraphine moved closer, close enough to see exhaustion in his face, close enough to recognize that isolation wasn't protecting him. It was killing him slowly while he pretended strength required being alone. You've spent 8 months learning that connection isn't weakness. Don't let one traitor erase everything we built, because you're more comfortable with emptiness than vulnerability. Emptiness keeps me alive. Vulnerability gets people killed. Then I guess I'll die. Because I'm not leaving. I'm not accepting demotion. I'm not pretending partnership was transaction just because you decided betrayal is inevitable. I'm staying here and fighting for what we built until you either remember why it mattered or kill me trying to protect yourself from the thing you need most. And what do I need most? Someone who won't leave when you're too damaged to believe they'll stay. Someone who understands that trust is risk, but isolation is guaranteed death. Someone who will fight for partnership even when you're fighting against it, because you've forgotten that strength isn't measured by how alone you can survive, but by what you're willing to protect. When survival means sharing power with someone who could destroy you. Her words hit him like physical impact. Seraphine watched his controls start fragmenting, saw the walls he'd rebuilt begin cracking under pressure from the truth he'd been avoiding since Heron died, proving that betrayal existed, but not that it was universal. "I can't do this," he said quietly. "Can't keep believing loyalty is real when every piece of evidence proves it's temporary. Can't keep letting you close when closeness means vulnerability, and vulnerability means eventual destruction. Then I'll do it for both of us. I'll keep believing. I'll keep proving partnership is real. I'll keep fighting for connection until you remember that the strongest thing you ever built wasn't isolation. It was us." She kissed him then, not asking permission, not waiting for him to remember how to want instead of calculate, just offering what she'd learned through 8 months of partnership. That trust required leap before evidence arrived. That love demanded vulnerability before safety was guaranteed. That survival meant choosing connection even when every instinct screamed that isolation was simpler. He kissed her back like drowning man finding air, desperate and terrified and hopeful in ways he'd forgotten how to be. And when they broke apart, his eyes were wet again because grief kept showing up when walls came down. "I don't know how to trust anymore." "Then learn again. Start with me. Start with believing I'm not Heron. Start with understanding that partnership means I've already chosen you over every other option, and betrayal would destroy what I've built as much as what you've built. Start with risk, because calculated safety is just slow death dressed as strategy. What if you're wrong? What if I let you close and you betray me anyway? Then I betray you. And you survive it like you've survived everything else. But at least you'll have tried. At least you'll have chosen connection over isolation. At least you'll have proven that the monster everyone fears is actually just a man who learned wrong lessons from cruel teachers and needed someone stubborn enough to teach him different." Kadric held her like she was the only thing preventing him from falling back into the emptiness that had almost consumed him. And Seraphine held him back, knowing that rebuilding trust would be harder than building it originally. That Heron's betrayal had damaged something fundamental. That partnership was wounded, but not dead. That healing required patience neither of them naturally possessed, and vulnerability both of them had learned to eliminate. But some battles couldn't be won through strength alone. Some victories required admitting defeat was possible and choosing to fight anyway. Some loves demanded exactly the thing power had trained them to eliminate. The courage to believe connection was worth the risk, even when risk meant catastrophic failure. Outside Blackthorn Keep, new threats gathered. Inside, 2 people who'd built an empire together learned that the hardest thing to govern wasn't territories or armies or aristocratic conspiracies. It was the space between isolation and trust, where survival transformed into something worth surviving for. The warning came at dawn when Blackthorn Keep's walls were still dark against sky that hadn't decided whether to deliver snow or rain. A rider from the southern border post, horse foaming, the man bleeding from wounds that suggested he'd fought through an ambush to deliver intelligence that couldn't wait for proper channels. Captain Thorne brought him directly to the war room where Kadric and Seraphine were already reviewing defensive positions because sleep had become something they scheduled around crisis management. The rider collapsed against the table. His message was 3 words before exhaustion took him. "They're coming now. Not in 2 weeks like intelligence predicted. Not with careful coordination that would give Blackthorn time to consolidate forces. Now. Immediately." The Southern Coalition had abandoned strategy for speed and was marching on Blackthorn Keep with 12,000 soldiers and enough supplies to siege the fortress until winter killed everyone inside. Kaedric looked at the maps showing defensive positions designed for threats that arrived with warning. looked at force projections showing Blackthorn's 4,000 garrison soldiers against 12,000 attackers who'd timed their assault to catch the fortress unprepared. Looked at Seraphine and saw his own calculation reflected back. They were outnumbered 3-1, and the enemy would reach Blackthorn's outer defenses within 18 hours. How many border patrol units can we recall before the siege starts? Maybe 1,000 if they ride hard enough to kill half their horses. Thorne's voice was level, but her expression suggested she'd already run the numbers and didn't like the conclusion. That gives us 5,000 against 12,000. Bad odds. We've survived worse odds. Kadric said it automatically, but they both knew it was lie. Blackthorn Keep had never faced coordinated assault from coalition this large. Individual threats, regional rebellions, bandit armies, never full-scale invasion led by nobles who'd learned from Kelridge and Heron's failures, and decided overwhelming force was the only strategy that worked against the Iron Duke. This is retaliation for Ravenmoor. Seraphine spoke quietly while studying maps that showed how inadequate Blackthorn's defenses suddenly looked. The southern houses watched you eliminate 7 noble families without trial and decided you'd become exactly the tyrant they'd always feared. This isn't about removing competent governance. This is about destroying you before you destroy them. Then they should have moved faster. Kadric's voice carried the cold certainty that came from spending 20 years turning threats into corpses. We have 18 hours to prepare defenses that will turn their numerical advantage into liability. Blackthorn Keep has survived this long because the fortress itself is weapon. Time to prove whether that's still true. The next 18 hours were orchestrated chaos. Soldiers recalled from border posts. Civilians evacuated to underground chambers that had been carved from mountain stone specifically for siege situations. Supplies inventoried and rationed. Weapons distributed. Every defensive mechanism Blackthorn Keep possessed activated and tested because failure during actual combat meant death instead of inconvenience. Seraphine coordinated civilian evacuation, while Kadric positioned military forces. Partnership functioning through crisis the way it had before Heron's betrayal temporarily fractured it. They moved around each other with practiced efficiency. No wasted words. No hesitation. Just 2 people who'd learned to operate as single organism when survival required precision instead of sentiment. By noon, the outer villages were emptied and their population secured inside Blackthorn's walls. By evening, the border patrol reinforcements arrived exhausted but alive and were immediately integrated into defensive positions. By midnight, the fortress was as prepared as 18 hours allowed, and the Southern Coalition's advance forces were visible on the horizon like storm clouds that promised destruction. Kadric stood on Blackthorn's highest tower, watching enemy campfires spread across the valley below. 12,000 soldiers, maybe more. Every southern house that resented northern independence and feared ducal authority combining their forces to eliminate the threat permanently. It was coordinated, professional, the kind of assault that succeeded through overwhelming numbers and sustained pressure until defenders broke from exhaustion. Seraphine joined him. She wore armor now, functional plate and leather that had been fitted specifically for combat instead of ceremony. Sword at her hip, hair bound tight. She looked like someone who'd accepted that the next days would be measured in violence and survival instead of strategy and negotiation. They're not planning to take prisoners. No. This is extermination. They learned from Kelridge that petitions fail, and from Heron that rebellion fails. This is their final strategy. Crush Blackthorn. Keep through force so overwhelming that competence doesn't matter. How long can we hold? Depends on whether they're willing to die in numbers large enough to breach the walls. Kadric's voice was analytical, clinical. The tone he used when calculating costs without acknowledging the costs were human lives, including potentially his own. Blackthorn Keep has provisions for 6 months. They'll run out of supplies in 3 if they maintain siege, but 3 months is long enough for them to find weaknesses. Long enough for our soldiers to break from constant defensive operations. Long enough for winter to arrive and turn siege into mutual suicide pact where last side standing wins by default. So we need to break the siege before that happens. We need to kill their leadership. Decapitate the coalition and the southern houses lose coordination. Individual forces retreat to protect their own territories. The siege collapses and we survive. That requires leaving the fortress and striking their command position. Suicide mission through 12,000 enemy soldiers. Yes. Kadric looked at her with eyes that had stopped being empty and started being something else. something that looked like acceptance, that survival might not be option anymore. Which is why I'm leading it personally. 20 elite soldiers, midnight assault, hit their command tent and kill every lord coordinating this invasion before they realize we've left the fortress. You're describing assassination raid during active siege. The risk is irrelevant compared to the alternative. If we stay defensive, they grind us down through attrition. If we strike their leadership, we either succeed and survive or fail and die fighting. I prefer the second option to slow death inside walls that become tomb. Then I'm coming with you. No. Partnership means shared risk. You taught me that. Partnership also means one of us survives to rebuild if this fails. You stay here. Command the garrison. If the assassination succeeds, press the advantage. If I don't return by dawn, negotiate surrender terms that protect the civilians and soldiers who fought for something they believed in. There are no surrender terms. This is extermination. You said so yourself. Then make them kill you last. Give the fortress time to see that resistance costs the coalition more than submission would have. Die slowly enough that some southern house decides protecting their own forces matters more than completing genocide. His voice softened just slightly, just enough to reveal the man underneath the commander. I need you alive, Seraphine. Need to know that if I don't survive this, someone who understands what we built will remember it correctly instead of letting history rewrite Blackthorn Keep as tyranny that deserved elimination. History doesn't matter if we're both dead. Then don't die. Live long enough to make them regret attacking. Long enough that the cost of destroying Blackthorn becomes lesson every southern house learns. Long enough that what we built survives in some form, even if we don't. He kissed her then, hard and desperate, like he was trying to memorize the feeling because memory might be all that survived the next 12 hours. And when he pulled back, his expression carried something that looked almost like peace. The kind desperate people found when they stopped fighting inevitability and just accepted that some battles ended in death, but fighting them anyway gave the death meaning. I love you. He said it simply, like confession that had been waiting years to find voice. Not performance, not strategy. Just truth delivered by someone who'd learned that isolation was prison and connection was exactly the strength that made survival worth the effort. I should have said it months ago. Should have trusted that what we built was real instead of waiting for betrayal that never came from you. Should have believed that love wasn't transaction. I was wrong about everything except you. Seraphine felt something crack in her chest. Not breaking, opening. The way frozen ground opened when spring finally convinced it that growth was possible again. Then come back alive and tell me again when we're not facing extinction. Tell me in the fortress we defended together. Tell me when we have time to build something permanent instead of just surviving until the next threat arrives. I'll try. But if I don't, you will. Because I'm not accepting any other outcome. You're going to kill their leadership and return by dawn, and we're going to hold this fortress until the coalition breaks. And then we're going to rebuild and prove that trust wasn't suicide. That partnership was the strongest thing either of us ever created. That love made us dangerous instead of weak. He left at midnight with 20 soldiers who'd volunteered knowing they probably wouldn't return. Elite fighters who'd served Blackthorn long enough to understand that some missions required sacrifice. That leadership meant going first into darkness that would kill most people who entered it. That the difference between commander and tyrant was willingness to die for what you demanded others protect. Seraphine watched them disappear into darkness beyond Blackthorn's walls and tried not to calculate probability of success versus catastrophic failure. Tried not to think about Kadric fighting through 12,000 enemy soldiers with only 20 companions. Tried not to imagine him dying in some anonymous field while she waited inside walls that would become tomb if the assassination failed. She failed at not thinking about it. The images came anyway, graphic and detailed because her mind had been trained to calculate worst scenarios and plan around them. This time, worst scenario was Kaedric's death, and there was no planning around it except maintaining defensive positions until the coalition breached walls and killed everyone inside. Captain Thorne found her in the war room, staring at maps that showed defensive lines and fallback positions and the careful architecture of Last Stand. He'll succeed. The captain's voice carried confidence she probably didn't feel, but offered anyway, because leaders lied to subordinates when truth would break morale. The Duke survived worse operations. He's never led assassination raid through force this large during active siege. The variables are manageable for someone with his experience. Thorne moved to the maps, adjusted troop positions, made small changes that optimized defense if the assassination succeeded and minimized casualties if it failed. He knows what he's doing. Trust that. I do trust it. That's what terrifies me. He knows exactly what he's doing, and what he's doing is probably suicide dressed as strategy. He's gambling everything on single strike because gambling feels more honest than slow death. Then we make sure this gamble pays off. The Coalition expects us to stay defensive, expects Blackthorn Keep to turtle and wait for rescue that won't arrive. We're going to do the opposite. The moment the Duke's raid creates chaos in their command structure, we sortie. Full assault from the walls while they're disorganized. Hit them hard enough that they break before they recover leadership. Turn their numerical advantage into liability when coordination collapses. That's high risk. If the raid fails and we sortie anyway, then we die fighting instead of waiting. Thorne's smile was not warm. I'd rather die on offense than defense. At least attacking gives us agency. Defending just postpones inevitable. The night stretched, minutes becoming hours, becoming eternity, while Seraphine coordinated defensive preparations and tried not to. Think about Kaedric moving through enemy territory with odds that made survival statistical impossibility. She walked the walls, checked weapons, spoke to soldiers who'd chosen to fight for Blackthorn Keep, and deserved commander who appeared confident even when confidence was performance masking terror. The attack came at deepest darkness. Not on Blackthorn's walls. In the Coalition camp below, where fire suddenly exploded and screaming started, and chaos rippled outward from command positions like stone thrown into still water. Kedric's raid had reached its target. For 20 minutes, the valley below was madness. Fires spreading, soldiers running toward combat or away from it, depending on whether they understood what was happening. Orders being shouted in multiple directions because command structure was collapsing and 12,000 soldiers were discovering that numerical advantage meant nothing when leadership died and coordination evaporated. Then the fire stopped spreading. The screaming became organized again, and Seraphine understood with cold certainty that the raid had failed to kill all the Southern Lords. Some had survived. Some were already re-establishing control. The window for sortie was closing, and if they missed it, the Coalition would recover and the siege would continue and everything Kaedric had risked would be wasted. She turned to Thorne. Sortie now. Full assault while they're still disorganized. We break them before leadership fully recovers. The captain didn't hesitate. Didn't question, didn't calculate odds. Just started shouting orders that sent Blackthorn's garrison flooding through gates toward enemy forces that outnumbered them, but had lost cohesion in the chaos. Seraphine led from the front because leadership meant demonstrating you'd risk what you demanded others sacrifice. She rode through gates with 2,000 soldiers behind her, and another 1,000 holding defensive positions in case the sortie failed and retreat became only option. The battle was immediate and brutal. Blackthorn forces crashing into Coalition soldiers who were still recovering from the assassination raid and didn't expect Defensive Fortress to suddenly go offensive. Steel on steel, screaming, blood on ground that was frozen enough to make footing treacherous. Men dying because they were too slow or too unlucky or too surprised to defend themselves properly. Seraphine fought with focused efficiency. Killing was mechanical now. Strike, block, strike again. Each death was transaction that purchased seconds of survival. Each body was obstacle removed from path toward Coalition command positions where Southern Lords were trying to reorganize forces that had lost coordination. She found Kaedric in the center of the chaos. He was alive, bleeding from multiple wounds but functional, fighting with mechanical precision that suggested he'd entered the state where pain was information that didn't affect performance. Around him, the 20 soldiers who'd followed him on the suicide raid. 12 still standing, 8 dead or dying. All of them buying time with their bodies while the Duke tried to finish what the assassination had started. The Southern Lords were regrouping, 5 of them. Out of the original 8 who'd organized the Coalition, 3 were dead, killed during the initial raid. The survivors were shouting orders and pulling their forces together, and if they succeeded, the numerical advantage would reassert, and Blackthorn's sortie would transform from aggressive strike into suicide charge. Seraphine made decision based on instinct rather than calculation. Made choice that strategy would have rejected, but partnership demanded. She drove toward the surviving lords with 50 soldiers who followed because their duchess was leading and following meant purpose, even if purpose was probably death. The southern forces tried to stop them. Walls of soldiers forming barrier between Seraphine and the lords she was targeting. She crashed through the first line, broke through the second, started hitting the third, and that's when the sword found her. Not killing strike, not immediately fatal, just blade entering her side between armor plates where protection was thin because mobility required gaps, and gaps invited exactly this kind of wound. Pain exploded through her body, white-hot and comprehensive. The kind of pain that shut down rational thought and replaced it with animal understanding that injury, this severe, meant dying soon unless treatment arrived faster than battlefield allowed. She killed the man who'd wounded her, kept moving forward because stopping meant bleeding out while coalition forces regrouped, reached the Southern lords who were still shouting orders and trying to maintain cohesion that was fracturing around them, killed 2 of them herself. Quick strikes that ended lives before they fully understood the Duchess they'd dismissed as political arrangement was the thing killing them. The other 3 tried to run, tried to retreat behind protective barriers of soldiers who'd lost the commanders they were supposed to protect. Kedrick reached her position, saw the wound in her side, saw blood that was flowing too fast for survival without immediate medical attention. His face went through expression she'd never seen before. Not emptiness, not control. Raw terror that someone he loved was dying and control couldn't prevent it. Fall back, his voice cracked. Seraphine, fall back now. Not until they're dead. She pointed at the fleeing lords. Not until every Southern house coordinating this siege loses leadership. Not until the coalition breaks permanently. You're bleeding out. Then I'm bleeding out while finishing what we started. She drove toward the fleeing lords. Kedrick beside her now. Both of them wounded. Both of them fighting with desperate efficiency that came from understanding this was probably their last battle and making it count mattered more than survival. The remaining lords fell. 1, 2, 3. Every Southern house that organized the coalition losing its leadership in blood-soaked field while their soldiers watched. Commanders die and started calculating whether continuing the siege was worth dying for, cause that had lost direction. The coalition broke. Not immediately, not with formal surrender, just slow dissolution as individual house forces started retreating toward their own territories instead of maintaining siege positions. Numerical advantage evaporating because 12,000 soldiers without unified command were just 12,000 people making individual decisions to not die for lords who were already dead. Blackthorn Keep had survived. The fortress still stood. The garrison was decimated but functional. The siege was broken before it really began because assassination raid had worked just well enough and sortie had been timed perfectly, and Southern lords had died before they could fully recover coordination. But Seraphine was dying. She understood that with clinical clarity. The wound in her side was too deep, blood loss too severe. Even with immediate treatment, survival was probability rather than certainty. Without treatment, death would arrive within the hour. Kedrick carried her back to Blackthorn Keep personally. Wouldn't let anyone else touch her. Wouldn't accept that carrying wounded person while injured himself was strategically stupid. Just held her and ran and screamed for physicians who were already overwhelmed with wounded soldiers but would prioritize the Duchess because rank bought treatment. She was placed on table in chambers that had been converted to field hospital. Physicians working with efficiency born from treating too many battlefield injuries. Cleaning wound, assessing damage, making calculations about whether survival was possible and what price it would require. The lead physician was old, experienced, had probably seen worse wounds survive and better wounds kill depending on variables no one fully understood. He looked at Kedrick with expression that suggested he was about to deliver news that would break whatever remained of the Duke's control. The blade hit organs. She's bleeding internally. We can try to repair the damage, but surgery this extensive with battlefield conditions and existing blood loss means low survival probability. Maybe 30% if she's lucky. And we're perfect. Try anyway. Kedrick's voice was hollow. Whatever it takes. Whatever it costs. Keep her alive. The surgery took hours. Seraphine drifted through consciousness, experiencing time as fragmented moments instead of continuous experience. Pain when physicians worked on the wound. Cold when blood loss dropped body temperature below functional range. Voices discussing whether she'd survive and what they'd try next if current efforts failed. Kedrick's voice through all of it. Talking to her when she was conscious. Talking at her when she wasn't. Saying things he'd probably never said before and might not say again. Confessions about fear and love and regret that he'd wasted so much time protecting himself from connection when connection was exactly what made survival worthwhile. She tried to respond, tried to tell him that 30% survival probability was better than zero, that she'd survived worse odds through competence and stubbornness. That partnership meant fighting for each other even when fighting looked futile. Her mouth wouldn't form words. Her body had prioritized survival over communication and was using available energy for staying alive instead of speech. The surgery finished as dawn broke through windows showing Blackthorn Keep still standing despite everything. The lead physician looked exhausted. His hands were covered in blood that was probably Seraphine's because he'd spent hours trying to repair damage that blade had caused. We've done everything possible. Now it depends on whether her body can recover from the trauma. Next 48 hours are critical. If she survives that long, probability improves significantly. If she doesn't, he didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. Everyone understood that if Seraphine didn't survive 48 hours, the wound would kill her despite the physician's best efforts. Kedrick didn't leave. Didn't attend to the fortress, or the wounded soldiers, or the 1,000 urgent matters that required ducal attention after successful defense against siege. Just stayed beside Seraphine while she fought battle that was more fundamental than any combat they'd survived together. The battle between life and death, when the body had to decide whether continuing was worth the effort. Hours passed. Seraphine's condition fluctuated. Moments of stability. Moments of crisis when physicians rushed in with interventions designed to prevent catastrophic failure. The cycle repeated. Stable. Crisis. Stable. Crisis. Each cycle wearing down her body's reserves and making next crisis more likely to be the fatal one. Kedrick talked through all of it, telling her about the fortress, about the coalition forces retreating completely now that leadership was confirmed dead, about the soldiers who'd survived and the ones who'd died protecting what they'd built together, about plans for rebuilding after the battle ended and reforms that would strengthen Blackthorn Keep against future threats, about everything except the possibility that she might not survive to see any of it. 48 hours became 72. 72 became 96. Seraphine's condition stopped fluctuating, stabilized at level that physicians cautiously described as survivable if complications didn't develop. Her body had decided continuing was worth the effort, had fought through blood loss and surgical trauma and the fundamental damage that Blade had caused, had chosen life over death through mechanisms no one fully understood but everyone was grateful for. She woke on the 5th day, vision blurry, body feeling like it had been disassembled and reassembled incorrectly. Pain everywhere but manageable pain. The kind that signaled damage healing instead of damage killing. Kedrick was beside her. He looked worse than she felt, exhausted beyond anything sleep could fix, face drawn, eyes carrying weight that came from spending 5 days believing the person he loved was dying and being unable to prevent it. You survived. His voice was rough. Apparently, her own voice was weak, barely more than whisper. How bad? You almost died. Multiple times. The physicians gave you 30% survival probability, and you beat the odds through competence and stubbornness. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Very characteristic. The siege? Broken. Coalition retreated after their leadership died. Blackthorn Keep stands. We won. At what cost? 300 soldiers dead, 800 wounded. You nearly killed among them. Too high a cost, but lower than alternative if siege had continued. His hand found hers, careful like he was afraid she'd break from touch. I thought I'd lost you. Thought I'd traded your life for fortress that wouldn't matter if you weren't alive to share it. Partnership means shared risk. I knew the odds. Partnership means not dying on me when I've just learned how to trust someone. His voice cracked. Don't do that again. Don't make me watch you bleed out while calculating whether saving you or saving the fortress matters more. Don't force me to choose between power and connection when connection is the only thing that makes power worth having. Then stop leading suicide raids and I'll stop following them with suicidal sorties. Deal? Deal. They stayed like that for a long time. Holding hands, not speaking, just existing together in space where death had almost won, but hadn't. Where survival felt temporary, but real. Where partnership had proven itself through exactly the kind of crisis that should have shattered it. The next weeks were recovery. Physical for Seraphine, emotional for Kedrick, fortress-wide for Blackthorn Keep. The Coalition's failed siege had proven that coordinated assault could be survived through competent defense and willingness to risk everything when risk was required. Southern houses that had supported the invasion were crippled, their lords dead, their forces decimated, their political influence destroyed by the same brutal efficiency Blackthorn had applied to Kelridge and Heron. The message was delivered. Opposition to Blackthorn Keep didn't just fail, it resulted in extinction. And the Northern Territories would be governed through partnership between Duke and Duchess, who'd proven they'd die protecting what they'd built before they'd surrender it to aristocrats who confused authority with entitlement. But peace was temporary. Peace was always temporary, because power attracted opposition the way blood attracted predators. Someone would eventually decide that Blackthorn's recent vulnerabilities made it target worth striking. Some coalition would form believing that next assault would succeed where this one failed. That was reality of governance through strength. Victory never finished the fight. It just postponed next battle. 6 weeks after the siege ended, new intelligence arrived. Not about Southern coalitions or Northern rebellions or political maneuvering in the capital. About something worse. Something that made every previous threat look manageable by comparison. The king was dying. Cancer or poison or time depending on which rumor you believed. The succession was contested. 3 potential heirs, each backed by different aristocratic factions, each promising different vision of how the kingdom should be governed. And every faction wanted Blackthorn Keep's support, because whoever controlled the North controlled resources and military force that would decide which heir took the throne. The crown itself was at stake, and Blackthorn Keep stood at the center of succession crisis that would determine whether the kingdom survived as unified entity or collapsed into civil war that would kill thousands and reshape the political landscape permanently. Ceadric stood in the council chamber studying intelligence reports about royal succession and faction positioning, and the careful mathematics of choosing sides when every choice guaranteed making. Powerful enemies. Seraphine sat across from him, still recovering but functional, still wounded but operational, still the partner who'd proven herself through crisis that should have killed her. We have to choose. His voice was level but carried understanding that choice would define everything that came after. Supporting one heir means opposing the other 2 and their backing houses. Neutrality means all 3 factions treat us as enemy, because refusing to help means refusing to be controlled. Either way, we're walking into succession war that makes the coalition siege look like practice run. Then we choose the heir most likely to leave us alone. Seraphine's voice was pragmatic. We don't need power at the capital. We need autonomy in the North. Find the heir who'll trade Northern independence for military support, and we support them completely. And if all 3 heirs want control instead of autonomy, then we support none of them and prepare for civil war that will test whether Blackthorn Keep can survive without royal backing. Her expression was hard. We've survived everything else. We'll survive this. Or die trying. Or die trying. She met his gaze without flinching. But at least we'll die as partners, fighting for something we built together. That's better ending than most people get. The intelligence reports kept coming. Faction movements, military positioning, aristocratic alliances forming and dissolving as houses calculated which heir offered best return on loyalty. The kingdom was fracturing, slowly, carefully. The kind of controlled collapse that looked stable until pressure tested it and everything shattered simultaneously. Blackthorn Keep stood at the center of the fracture, the strongest independent force in the kingdom, the deciding factor in succession that would reshape power structures permanently. The target every faction would eventually strike if support couldn't be secured peacefully. Ceadric looked at Seraphine across the council table, covered in maps and intelligence and the evidence that their victory over the coalition had just made them more valuable and therefore more vulnerable. Are you ready for this? For succession war that will make everything we've survived look preliminary? For choosing sides in conflict where wrong choice means extinction and right choice means decades fighting to defend the heir we selected? No, but I'm ready to face it with you, ready to prove that partnership is the strongest weapon we have, ready to build something permanent instead of just surviving until next threat arrives. Then we choose the heir, we choose carefully, and we prepare for war that will test everything we've learned about survival and strength, and the difference between power that isolates and power that connects. They leaned over the maps together, 2 people who'd survived assassination and betrayal and siege and near death. 2 people who'd learned that trust was risk, but isolation was guaranteed death. 2 people who'd built empire through brutal competence and were about to discover whether that empire could survive succession crisis that would reshape the kingdom. Outside Blackthorn Keep, storm clouds gathered, not weather, politics, the kind that killed kingdoms when they struck. Inside, the Iron Duke and his Duchess prepared for the battle that would either secure their legacy or destroy everything they'd built. The choice was made. The heir was selected. The messages were sent to the capital announcing Blackthorn Keep's support. And the civil war that would define the next generation began with single declaration that the North stood with Prince Aldrich against his siblings and their backing factions. The response was immediate. 2 of the 3 factions declared Blackthorn Keep enemy of the crown, declared the Duke and Duchess traitors to royal authority, declared that northern independence would be crushed, and the territories brought under direct royal control administered by nobles who understood that power came from throne, not competence, declared war, not siege, not political maneuvering, actual civil war that would split the kingdom and kill thousands, and test whether Blackthorn Keep's partnership was strong enough to survive being targeted by every force that wanted them destroyed. Ceadric stood on Blackthorn's walls watching horizon where enemy forces were gathering again. Different enemies, larger numbers, higher stakes, the kind of existential threat that ended with either total victory or complete extinction. Seraphine joined him, healed now, scarred but functional, ready for war that would determine whether what they'd built survived long enough to become permanent. This is it, the war we can't avoid, the choice that commits us completely. Yes. Are you afraid? Terrified. But terror doesn't matter. Survival matters. Winning matters. Protecting what we built matters. She took his hand. We've survived everything else together. We'll survive this. Or die trying, or die trying. They stood together on the walls while darkness gathered and war approached, and the future they'd built together hung in balance that would tip toward survival or extinction, depending on choices not yet made and battles not yet fought. The Civil War had begun, and Blackthorn Keep stood at its center, target and prize and the force that would determine how the kingdom rebuilt itself when the fighting finally ended. If they survived long enough to see the ending, the Civil War lasted 3 years. Not 3 years of continuous battle. War never worked that way. It was months of maneuvering punctuated by weeks of violence. Long stretches of strategic positioning interrupted by days when men died screaming and blood turned frozen ground into mud that swallowed corpses before anyone could count them properly. Blackthorn Keep became the anvil against which the kingdom's future was hammered into shape. Prince Aldrich's forces used the fortress as staging ground for campaigns that slowly crushed his siblings' backing factions. The northern territories supplied soldiers and resources, and the brutal competence that came from governance built through solving problems instead of inheriting authority. Ceadric and Seraphine commanded together, not symbolically, actually, leading campaigns that required understanding how power worked when separated from performance, making decisions that killed people but kept more people alive than the alternatives would have, learning that survival at scale meant calculating costs in thousands instead of individuals, and accepting that leadership required carrying weight of those calculations forever. The war changed them, changed everyone who survived it. You couldn't spend 3 years watching kingdoms fracture and cities burn and families destroy each other over which royal bloodline deserved ceremonial throne without. Understanding that power was temporary and violence was permanent, and the difference between hero and monster was mostly about which side won and got to write the history. The final battle happened in the capital itself. Prince Aldrich's forces against his sister's remaining armies in streets that had been built for ceremony and commerce, not warfare. The fighting was brutal and close. Building to building, room to room. The kind of urban combat that eliminated tactical advantage and reduced warfare to which side was more willing to die in numbers large enough to overwhelm the other. Blackthorn's soldiers fought with mechanical efficiency. They'd been trained through actual governance instead of parade ground exercises. Knew that survival required competence instead of courage. Understood that fear was information that helped you stay alive if you didn't let it paralyze you. Ceadric led from positions that were dangerous but not suicidal. He'd learned through Ravenmoor and the Coalition siege that leadership required surviving long enough to make decisions instead of dying heroically and leaving subordinates without direction. Seraphine commanded the reserve forces, positioned to reinforce breakthrough or cover retreat depending on how the battle developed. They operated as single organism distributed across battlefield. 2 people who'd learned to think together through years of partnership that had been tested by everything except permanent separation. The battle lasted 2 days. When it ended, Prince Aldrich controlled the capital and his sister's forces were shattered beyond recovery. The civil war was functionally over. The succession was decided. The kingdom had new king, and that king owed his throne to Blackthorn Keep's support and the brutal competence that came from northern governance. But victory felt hollow. Ceadric stood in the royal palace where Prince Aldrich was being crowned and watched aristocrats who'd spent 3 years killing each other suddenly pretend they'd always supported the winning side. Watched them bow before the new king and offer loyalty that would last exactly as long as convenient. Watched the machinery of power reassert itself like the Civil War had been interruption instead of fundamental restructuring. Nothing had changed. Not really. The faces were different, the king was younger, but the system remained identical. Performance over competence, inheritance over merit. Authority distributed based on bloodline instead of capacity to actually govern. 3 years of war. Thousands dead. The kingdom nearly destroyed. And the result was restoration of exactly the dysfunction that had made civil war inevitable in the first place. Seraphine found him in the gardens outside the palace, away from the coronation ceremony and the celebration that felt obscene when bodies were still being collected from streets where the final battle had been fought. You're thinking about how pointless this was. I'm thinking about how we spent 3 years killing people to install a king who will govern exactly like his father. Same corruption, same incompetence. Same prioritization of aristocratic privilege over functional administration. We didn't change anything. We just determined which royal family got to preside over dysfunction. We kept the northern territories functional. That's not nothing. It's not enough. Ceadric's voice was tired. Not physically, existentially. The kind of exhaustion that came from spending 3 years believing the fighting mattered only to discover victory just meant returning to systems that had failed before and would fail again. We survived. But survival isn't the same as building something better. It's just extending the timeline before the next crisis arrives. So what do we do? Accept that governance is always performance and power is always temporary and everything we built will eventually collapse under its own weight? I don't know anymore. He looked at her. At the woman who'd nearly died defending what they'd built. Who'd spent 3 years commanding soldiers and making decisions that killed people and carrying the weight. Of leadership that required accepting that sometimes everyone dies, and you have to choose which everyone. I used to think competence was enough, that if we governed well enough, we'd prove better systems were possible. But the kingdom doesn't want better systems. It wants familiar dysfunction that lets aristocrats profit from failures everyone else pays for. They stood in gardens that had been damaged during the battle and were being restored by workers who'd survived the fighting. Life continuing. Recovery happening. The world moving forward because stagnation was death, and humans were too stubborn to accept death as permanent condition. Seraphine took his hand, held it with grip that had been strengthened through 3 years of wielding weapons and signing execution orders, and doing the work that leadership required when leadership meant making decisions no one else would make. We don't have to stay. The coronation is finished. Our obligation to Prince Aldrich is fulfilled. We can return to Blackthorn Keep and govern the territories without involving ourselves in capital politics. Build what we want in the north and let the south collapse or survive on its own terms. And when the south collapses? When the new king's incompetence creates the next crisis? Do we intervene again or do we watch the kingdom burn while protecting only our territories? We protect what's ours. Let everyone else learn that survival requires competence or die proving it doesn't. We've spent 3 years teaching that lesson. If they haven't learned it yet, more teaching won't help. That's cold, that's realistic. We can't save people who don't want to be saved. We can't fix systems that benefit from being broken. All we can do is build something functional in the space we control and hope it survives long enough to matter. Ceadric looked at this palace, at the symbol of authority that had required 3 years of warfare to preserve, at the institution that would probably need preserving again within a generation, because nothing fundamental had changed except which family controlled the ceremonial power. Then we go home. Back to Blackthorn Keep. Back to governing territories that actually value competence over performance. We build what we can build and defend what we can defend and accept that changing the kingdom was always impossible. Goal attempted by people too stubborn to recognize impossibility until after they'd wasted years trying. Is that acceptance or surrender? It's wisdom. Knowing the difference between battles worth fighting and battles that just waste lives proving you were willing to fight them. His expression softened, just enough to show the man underneath the commander. I'm tired, Seraphine. Tired of fighting wars that don't change anything. Tired of killing people to preserve systems that will fail anyway. Tired of pretending strength means never admitting you're exhausted. Then rest. We've earned it. 3 years of war. We're allowed to be tired. They left the capital the next morning. No ceremony, no formal farewell. Just quiet departure by people who'd fulfilled obligation and wanted nothing except distance from the machinery of power that had consumed 3 years of their lives. The journey back to Blackthorn Keep took 2 weeks through territories that were slowly recovering from civil war. Villages rebuilding, farms replanting. People continuing because continuation was the only option when the alternative was accepting that destruction was permanent. Kaedric watched the recovery and felt something that might have been hope if hope wasn't so exhausting. These people hadn't waited for kings or nobles or ducal authority to tell them recovery was permitted. They'd just started rebuilding because survival required it. No grand strategy. No political calculation. Just stubborn refusal to let war define them permanently. That was strength, not the kind that came from dominating others. The kind that came from refusing to be dominated by circumstances. The kind that rebuilt when everything collapsed and continued. When continuation seemed impossible and found meaning in survival instead of requiring meaning to justify survival. Maybe that was the lesson. Not that competent governance could fix broken systems, but that people were resilient enough to survive broken systems if given space to rebuild themselves. That strength wasn't about controlling everything. It was about creating conditions where people could exercise their own strength instead of depending on authority to protect them. He'd spent 20 years believing power meant preventing collapse. Maybe it actually meant accepting that collapse was inevitable and building structures that helped people survive it when it arrived. Maybe leadership wasn't about being strong enough to carry everything. It was about being honest enough to admit you couldn't and wise enough to distribute the weight so no single person broke under it. They reached Blackthorn Keep in early spring when snow was finally surrendering to something that looked almost like warmth. The fortress stood exactly as they'd left it. Black stone walls, iron gates. The architectural embodiment of power that had survived everything the kingdom could throw at it through combination of competence and brutal willingness to defend what mattered. But the fortress felt different now, not physically, psychologically. It wasn't symbol of dominance anymore. It was home, the place they'd built together, the space where partnership had proven itself stronger than isolation and trust, had survived being tested by everything except permanent betrayal that never came. The soldiers who'd survived the war welcomed them back with exhaustion that matched their commanders. Everyone was tired. Everyone had lost people. Everyone had learned that victory cost more than anyone calculated at the beginning. And the people who survived were the ones who'd accepted the cost without letting it break them. Captain Thorne had held the fortress during their absence. She looked older now, scarred in ways that weren't visible but changed how she moved through space. The war had marked everyone it touched. Some marks were physical. Most were internal. The kind that shaped how you thought about power and survival and whether anything you built would matter after you stopped being around to defend it. "Welcome home," she said simply. The territories stayed functional. Revenue is stable. No major uprisings. A few minor disputes between border houses, but nothing that required ducal intervention. "We held what you built." "Thank you." Kaedric's voice carried gratitude that was too deep for adequate expression. For holding the fortress. For keeping the territories stable. For demonstrating that governance could continue even when the people who built it were fighting wars somewhere else. Partnership isn't limited to 2 people. Thorne smiled. It's a system. You built the system well enough that it functioned without constant supervision. That's the real test of leadership. Whether what you create survives your absence. The first weeks back were adjustment. Relearning how to govern territories instead of armies. Relearning how to make decisions that shaped years instead of battles. Relearning how to exist in space that wasn't defined by immediate threat, requiring immediate response. It was harder than the war in some ways. War was simple. Survive. Win. Protect what matters. Peace was complex. Hundreds of small decisions that accumulated into governance. Thousands of minor problems that required attention before they became crises. The endless work of maintaining systems that only stayed functional through constant care. But it was also better. Because peace meant time. Time to think about what they'd built and whether it was worth maintaining. Time to evaluate costs and benefits of power that had been purchased through methods that haunted both of them. Time to decide whether they wanted to continue being the Iron Duke and his Duchess, or whether they wanted to become something else. Something softer, maybe. Something that didn't require maintaining fear as primary governance tool. Kaedric spent hours in his study reviewing 3 years of reports from territories that had continued functioning during the Civil War. The eastern provinces Seraphine had rebuilt were still prosperous. The border regions he'd fortified were still secure. The merchant networks they'd restructured were still generating wealth that funded everything else. The system worked. Not perfectly, but reliably. In ways that didn't depend on their constant intervention. Seraphine found him there one evening. He was standing at the window watching sunset turn mountains the color of old blood. Beautiful and violent, like everything else in the north. You're thinking about whether we can stop. I'm thinking about whether we should stop. Whether the territories need us anymore, or whether we're just maintaining power because releasing it feels like admitting everything we did was temporary. Everything is temporary. The question is whether temporary means it didn't matter. Does it matter? We spent 20 years building governance through brutal competence. Spent 3 more years fighting war that didn't change the kingdom. Now we're back where we started, except older and more tired and carrying weight of everyone who died so we could survive. Did any of it matter beyond extending the timeline before the next crisis arrives? Seraphine moved to stand beside him, close enough to feel his presence without crowding the space he needed to think through questions that didn't have clean answers. Yes, it mattered, because the territories are functional, because people who would have starved under previous governance are alive, because villages that would have been destroyed by bandits are secure, because systems that reward competence exist in space where only performance mattered before. We didn't change the kingdom, but we changed the North. That's not nothing. It's not enough. Enough for what? To justify the methods we used? To balance the people we killed? To prove we were heroes instead of monsters who happened to govern well? She looked at him with eyes that had learned to see past the control he maintained even when exhausted. There's no enough when you're measuring lives against lives. No calculation that makes it clean. We did what we believed necessary. Some of it was necessary. Some of it was probably excessive. We'll never know for certain because we don't get to see the alternative timeline where we chose differently. So we just accept that governance required becoming thing we spent years fighting against. We accept that power changes people, and we were changed by it. That doesn't mean we became what we fought. It means we learned that the difference between protection and domination is smaller than we wanted to believe, and maintaining that difference requires constant attention instead of assuming good intentions prevent bad outcomes. Kaedric was silent for a long time. Outside the window, sunset finished its work, and darkness arrived with the patience of something that knew eventually everything surrendered to it. I don't want to be the Iron Duke anymore. The words came quietly, like confession that had been waiting years to find voice. Don't want to be the monster everyone fears because fear was the only tool that worked when everything else failed. Don't want to govern through threats and brutal competence and the promise that opposition ends in extinction. I'm tired of being strong in ways that require staying empty. Then stop. Be something else. Be the person who built partnership instead of empire. Be the man who learned trust wasn't weakness and connection wasn't vulnerability. Be someone who governs because it needs doing instead of because power is the only thing that kept you safe. She took his hand. We can change how we govern. Can distribute more authority to regional administrators. Can transition from direct control to oversight that trusts competent people to manage their own territories. Can build systems that don't depend on us maintaining fear because the systems themselves are functional enough that people follow them voluntarily. That requires trusting people won't abuse distributed authority the way Heron did. Heron abused authority because he wanted power without accountability. If we build accountability into the system instead of depending on our personal oversight, abuse becomes harder. Not impossible, but harder. And when it happens, we address it through systemic response instead of personal execution. You're describing governance through institutions instead of individuals. I'm describing governance that might survive us, that might continue functioning after we're too old or too dead to maintain it personally, that might prove what we built was worth building because it lasted beyond our ability to defend it. Kaedric looked at her, at the woman who'd arrived at Blackthorn Keep as political consolation prize and transformed into partner who'd survived everything except the possibility that partnership might end. At the person who'd taught him that strength included knowing when to stop being strong in ways that isolated you from everything worth protecting. How do we start? By admitting we don't have all the answers. by asking the people we govern what they actually need instead of assuming we know better, by accepting that good governance includes making space for people to govern themselves instead of depending on our competence to solve every problem. She paused. By being willing to fail at building something better instead of succeeding at maintaining something functional but brutal. The reforms took years. Not dramatic reshaping, gradual transition, authority distributed to regional councils that had actual power instead of advisory capacity. Judicial systems restructured to include representation from communities being governed instead of just ducal appointment. Trade networks expanded to include merchant voices in policy decisions that affected their operations. Military command decentralized, so border security didn't depend entirely on Blackthorn's direct control. It was messier than centralized authority. Slower, more complicated, required negotiating with people who had different priorities, and accepting that consensus meant compromise and compromise meant not getting optimal solutions to every problem. But it was also more resilient, because when Kaedric and Seraphine weren't personally managing every decision, the systems had to function independently, had to develop their own competence instead of depending on ducal intervention, had to prove that governance could be distributed without collapsing into the dysfunction that had required Blackthorn's original intervention. Some reforms failed. Some regional councils proved incompetent and had to be restructured. Some distributed authority was abused and had to be reclaimed temporarily until better systems could be built. But failure was information instead of catastrophe, because the overall system was robust enough to absorb individual failures without collapsing entirely. 5 years after returning from the Civil War, Blackthorn Keep was fundamentally different. Still strong. Still the most powerful force in the Northern Territories. But power was distributed instead of concentrated. Governance was collaborative instead of dictatorial. The fortress that had been symbol of domination transformed into center of administration that actually served the territories instead of controlling them. Kaedric barely recognized himself in the man he'd become. The emptiness that had defined him for 20 years was gone, replaced by something that felt almost like peace. Except peace was too simple a word for the complex understanding that strength included vulnerability and power included admitting limitations and leadership included trusting other people to lead. He'd learned that the strongest thing he ever built wasn't isolation that kept him safe from betrayal. It was partnership that made survival worth the effort. That connection was exactly the strength that made everything else possible. That trust was risk, but isolation was guaranteed death of everything that made life meaningful beyond mere continuation. Seraphine found him in the gardens they'd planted together. 5 years of growth had transformed bare ground into something beautiful. Not decorative beauty, functional beauty. Gardens that produced food and medicine and space for people to exist without immediate threat, demanding immediate response. You're thinking about your father. I'm thinking about how he died trusting people who betrayed him, and how I spent 20 years believing that proved trust was suicide. How wrong I was. How trust wasn't the problem. Choosing wrong people was the problem. He looked at her. You were right people. Right person. The only person who proved that partnership could survive being tested by everything except permanent betrayal that never came. Are you happy? She asked it carefully. Like the question itself was fragile and might break if handled roughly. I don't know if happy is the right word. I'm at peace, maybe, with what we built, with who I became building it, with the understanding that I was monster for a while and that was necessary and also insufficient, and learning to be something else required admitting the monster was protection that became prison. That's growth. That's what wisdom looks like when you stop pretending strength means never changing. Then I'm wise and exhausted and grateful. I found someone stubborn enough to teach me that power shared is power multiplied instead of power lost. He smiled, genuine, no emptiness underneath. Just the complicated satisfaction that came from surviving long enough to understand that survival wasn't the victory. Building something worth surviving for was the victory. They stood in gardens while wind moved through plants that had grown from seeds they'd planted together. While the fortress continued its work around them, while the territories they'd spent decades building continued functioning through systems that no longer required their constant intervention. Somewhere in the capital, King Aldrich was probably making the same mistakes his father had made because systems resisted change even when change was necessary. Somewhere in the southern provinces, noble houses were probably plotting ways to reclaim power they'd lost during the Civil War. Somewhere new, threats were probably gathering because power always attracted opposition, and opposition always tested whether power was real or performance. But those were problems for other people to solve or fail to solve on their own terms. Blackthorn Keep had done its part, had survived everything the kingdom threw at it, had proven that competent governance was possible even in territories everyone else had written off as ungovernable. Now it was time to let the systems function. Let the distributed authority prove itself. Let the people they'd spent years protecting learn to protect themselves. That was the final lesson, that the strongest governance didn't make people dependent on authority. It made people capable of governing themselves. That leadership wasn't about being strong enough to carry everything. It was about being wise enough to teach others how to carry their own weight. That night, alone in chambers that had witnessed everything from first meeting to nearly dying to rebuilding partnership that had been fractured by betrayal and restored through stubborn refusal to accept that isolation was inevitable, Caedric and Seraphine lay together in darkness that felt comfortable instead of threatening. "Do you have regrets?" she asked quietly. "Thousands. Every person who died because of decisions I made. Every brutal method I used because I believed ends justified means. Every time I chose fear over trust, because fear was simpler. All of it haunts me." He paused. "But I don't regret finding you. Don't regret learning that partnership was possible. Don't regret building something that might survive us because we built it well enough to function independently. The regrets are permanent, but so is the understanding that despite everything, what we built mattered. That's the most honest thing you've ever said. I'm trying honesty now. Seems to work better than pretending control equals strength." They held each other while the fortress settled into night rhythms. Guards changing shifts, fires being banked. The endless work of maintaining space that protected people from darkness that was always waiting just beyond the walls. Years passed. The distributed governance systems continued proving themselves. Regional councils developed their own competence. The Northern Territories prospered through combination of functional institutions and people who'd learned that survival required participation instead of depending on authority to solve problems for them. Caedric and Seraphine aged together. Not dramatically, just the slow accumulation of years that changed how they moved and thought and understood the world. Power gradually transferred from their direct control to the systems they'd built. Authority became advisory instead of absolute. The fortress that had been center of empire became administrative hub for territories that governed themselves with increasing independence. They became elders instead of rulers, teachers instead of commanders. People who'd survived long enough to understand that wisdom wasn't about having answers. It was about asking better questions and trusting the next generation to find answers that worked for them. The Iron Duke became Old Duke, who walked gardens and advised regional councils and told stories about civil war and succession crisis, and the years when Blackthorn Keep stood against everything the kingdom threw at it and survived through brutal competence and partnership that proved stronger than isolation. The stories weren't all heroic. Caedric was honest about the brutality, about the executions and the methods that had been necessary and also excessive, about the people who died and the choices that haunted him, and the understanding that power corrupted everyone, who held it, and the only defense was admitting corruption was happening and trying to minimize the damage. Young administrators listened with expressions that suggested they understood the lessons, but also believed they'd handle power better, that they'd avoid the mistakes, that their generation would govern with perfect balance between strength and mercy. Caedric let them believe it. Everyone needed to believe they'd be different. That wisdom could be inherited instead of earned through surviving mistakes. That understanding cost without paying it yourself was possible. They'd learn, or they wouldn't. Either way, it was their turn to try. 20 years after returning from the Civil War, Caedric stood on Blackthorn's walls watching winter arrive with the same patient inevitability it always had. Snow falling, wind cutting through anything that thought itself protected, mountains refusing to acknowledge human attempts at permanence. He was 70 now, old enough that mortality was visible on horizon instead of theoretical threat that might arrive eventually. Old enough that he thought about legacy instead of immediate survival. Old enough to understand that what he'd built would outlive him or it wouldn't, and either way, he'd done what he could do. Seraphine joined him. She moved slower now. The wound from the coalition siege had healed but left permanent damage that made cold weather painful. They both carried marks from the years, scars visible and invisible, the cost of surviving long enough to become old. "Are you ready?" she asked. "For dying?" "Not particularly, but acceptance isn't about being ready. It's about understanding that continuation is temporary and making peace with that before the temporary runs out. That's very philosophical for someone who used to measure everything in survival metrics. I learned from good teacher. He took her hand, held it with grip that had weakened with age, but remained steady through intention. You taught me that strength included vulnerability, that power shared was power multiplied, that love wasn't transaction and trust wasn't weakness and partnership was exactly the thing that made survival worth the effort. And you taught me that competence matters, that survival requires being functional instead of decorative, that sometimes brutal methods are necessary, and the only thing that separates necessary from excessive is being honest about which is which. They stood together while snow fell and darkness gathered, and the fortress continued its work below them. People living, problems being solved, systems functioning through competence that had been built slowly over decades by people who'd learned that governance required work instead of authority. This is what success looks like, Kadrick said quietly. Not perfect, not finished, just functional enough that people can build their own lives without depending on someone strong enough to protect them from every threat. That's the victory. Not that we governed well, but that we built systems that let other people learn to govern themselves. Is that enough? For me? Yes. I spent 20 years believing strength meant being strong enough to carry everything. Spent 10 more learning that strength meant teaching others how to carry their own weight. Now I'm ready to let them prove whether the teaching worked. Ready to stop, ready to rest. They left the walls together, descended stairs that had been climbed thousands of times during years when survival required constant vigilance, moved through corridors that had witnessed everything from first meeting to nearly dying to rebuilding partnership that had transformed them both, reached chambers where they'd shared years of life that had been brutal and beautiful and worth every cost except the people who died proving it was possible. That night they held each other in darkness that felt like peace instead of threat, like the end of something that had been worth doing even when it required becoming things they'd never planned to be, like the understanding that life measured in impact instead of duration, and what they'd built would ripple forward through time in ways they'd never see, but could trust existed because the foundations were solid. Kadrick died in his sleep 2 weeks later. Heart finally stopping after 70 years of carrying weight that would have crushed weaker organs decades earlier. Peaceful death. The kind that came from exhaustion that had finally been allowed to win instead of constantly fought. Seraphine held his hand through the transition, felt his breathing slow and stop, felt warmth gradually fade from skin that had touched hers with increasing gentleness, as years taught him that strength included knowing when to be soft. She didn't cry. Not immediately. Grief would come later in waves that would break her temporarily before she rebuilt herself the way she'd always rebuilt after everything else collapsed. Now she just sat with the understanding that partnership had ended through natural conclusion instead of betrayal. That trust had survived being tested by everything, including death. That love had proven itself real by lasting until one of them stopped being able to continue it. The funeral was simple, northern style. Pyre burning on the mountain above Blackthorn Keep where smoke could be seen across the territories he'd spent decades building. Soldiers who'd served under him, administrators who'd learned from him, people whose lives had been shaped by governance that prioritized competence over performance and results over authority. They came to honor the Iron Duke who'd become Old Duke, who'd become the man who'd taught them that strength included admitting weakness and power included distributing authority and leadership. Included trusting others to lead after you stopped being able to. Seraphine spoke at the pyre, told the truth about who he'd been. Not sanitized heroic version, real version. The man who'd been monster when necessary and learned to be something gentler when possible. Who'd governed through brutal methods and gradually transformed into someone who governed through systems that didn't require brutality. Who'd learned that trust was risk worth taking, and partnership was strength worth building, and love was exactly the thing that made power bearable instead of poisonous. The territories mourned, but they also continued, because the systems he'd built were robust enough to survive his death, because distributed governance meant no single person's absence collapsed everything, because he'd done the work of teaching others how to carry weight he'd spent 20 years carrying alone. Seraphine lived another decade. She governed with the same competence Kadrick had taught her, but with less fear and more trust. Watched the systems they'd built continue proving themselves, Watched young administrators make mistakes and learn from them, and gradually develop their own competence that didn't depend on her intervention. Watched the Northern Territories prosper through combination of functional institutions and people who'd learned that survival required participation instead of dependence on authority. She died at 80, surrounded by administrators and soldiers and people whose lives had been shaped by governance that proved competence, mattered, and partnership worked, and trust was exactly the thing that separated civilization from organized violence. They buried her beside Kedrick on the mountain above Blackthorn Keep, two people who'd built something that outlived them, two people who'd proven that power shared was power multiplied and love was strength instead of weakness, and partnership was exactly the thing that made survival worth the effort. Decades later, students studying governance history would examine the Blackthorn model as example of how distributed authority could function when built correctly, would analyze the reforms and transitions and gradual shift from centralized control to collaborative governance, would debate whether the brutal methods used during establishment were justified by the functional systems that survived afterward, would miss the actual lesson entirely. Because the lesson wasn't about governance systems or reform strategies or institutional design. The lesson was that power changed everyone who held it, and the only defense was admitting the change was happening and choosing deliberately who you became instead of letting power decide for you. The lesson was that isolation was prison disguised as protection, and connection was exactly the strength that made everything else possible. The lesson was that trust was risk, but life without risk was just extended dying dressed as safety. The lesson was that love required vulnerability, and vulnerability required courage. And courage meant choosing connection even when every instinct screamed that isolation was simpler. The lesson was that the strongest thing you could build wasn't empire or fortress or governance system that controlled everything. It was partnership with someone who proved that trust wasn't always betrayal, and connection wasn't always weakness, and love was exactly the thing that made power bearable instead of corrosive. That was what the Iron Duke and his Duchess had learned through decades of surviving everything except each other. That was what they'd built in the Northern Territories, where winter never really ended, and survival required being brutal and gentle simultaneously. That was what remained long after they died, and the fortress became history, and the stories became lessons for people who'd never known what it cost to learn them. The understanding that strength wasn't about being strong enough to stand alone. It was about being wise enough to know when to stop standing alone and start building something with someone who'd proven they'd still be standing beside you when everything else collapsed. That was the only victory that mattered. That was the only legacy worth leaving. That was the truth the Iron Duke learned too late and spent his remaining years trying to teach anyone who'd listen. Power was temporary, partnership was permanent, and love was exactly the thing that separated survival from life worth surviving for.